Most people imagine empires built by armies and conquest, governments risen through force and royal decree. But the truth is far quieter, and perhaps stranger still. The most powerful empire in human history was not founded by generals or kings. It was founded by merchants, by ordinary traders in London, men in wool coats and leather gloves, men who gathered in meeting halls to discuss ledgers and profit margins, who signed their names to papers by candlelight, never quite knowing they were inventing a new form of power entirely. The East India Company would become something no one had ever seen before, a private corporation that would rule over tens of millions of people, command its own armies, mint its own currency, and wage its own wars. And it all began on a cold evening in the year 1600, not with a battle cry or a proclamation, but with the simple hope that distant spices might make men rich. If you've ever wondered how a single commercial enterprise could transform into something larger than most nations, how profit could become power, and how trade could become territory, then consider joining us for a slow-paced journey through world history's quietest turning points, beginning with this strange and fateful rise of the company that swallowed an empire. Each journey unfolds at a pace designed for deep thinking and deeper rest. Picture London as evening falls. The year is 1600, the reign of Elizabeth I, and the city sits on the threshold between a medieval past and something altogether new. The Thames runs dark and busy with wherries, those light wooden boats that ferry merchants and their goods between the crowded docks. The air carries the smell of salt and tar, and something else, something that makes men's mouths water, even after months at sea. Spice, black pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace. These are not mere seasonings in the year 1600. They are currency. They are medicine. They are luxury beyond measure, worth their weight in gold, traded like jewels across every court in Europe. A single pound of cloves, if you could obtain it, might cost a working man's annual wage. A handful of nutmeg might ransom a minor lord from debt. For centuries, the Portuguese had held a near-absolute monopoly on the spice trade. They had sailed around Africa, established fortifications on the coasts of Asia, and created a seaborne empire of trading posts that funneled all the world's finest spices through Lisbon, where they were taxed, marked up, and distributed to European merchants at staggering profit. But by 1600, the Portuguese grip was loosening. The Dutch were beginning to probe eastward, aggressive and methodical, and England, rising naval power though it was, had precious few footholds in Asia at all. English merchants watched from the margins, studying charts, calculating routes, waiting for an opening. The seas that led to the East Indies seemed impossibly distant, impossibly dangerous, impossibly expensive to reach. And yet, in the months before the new century turned, a group of merchants in London began to gather. They were not knights or nobles, though some had minor titles. They were traders, investors, men with capital to risk and a hunger for return. Some had served on trading expeditions to the Levant, the Mediterranean edge of the Ottoman Empire. Others were simply wealthy enough to see an opportunity and bold enough to pursue it. They began to petition the crown for a charter, a royal document that would grant them the exclusive right to trade with the East Indies, to establish factories and posts, to conduct commerce on England's behalf in lands that most Englishmen would never see. The petition moved slowly through the machinery of royal government. Elizabeth I was in her final years, aging and deliberate. Her advisors weighed the risks. An expedition to the East Indies would be enormously costly. The company would need capital, it would need ships, it would need men willing to risk their lives in waters infested with pirates, disease, and the unforgiving elements. But the potential rewards were dazzling. If even a fraction of the spice trade could be diverted from Portuguese and Dutch hands into English ones, the wealth flowing back would be immense. The crown would benefit from taxes and fees. London merchants would grow rich. the nation's power and prestige would expand. On the 31st of December in the year 1600, in the very last day of the last year of the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I signed the Charter. It was not a grand ceremony. There was no trumpet fanfare, no procession. It was a document, written in the careful legal language of the time, stamped with the royal seal. The Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, it read, chartered, licensed, granted a monopoly on English trade with all lands east of the Cape of Good Hope. In the candlelit counting houses and merchant halls of London, the news spread quietly. Men gathered around tables, reading the charter's clauses, calculating their own investments. Some merchants purchased shares for hundreds of pounds, then a vast sum. Others contributed smaller amounts, betting their modest fortunes on the unknown. The initial capital raised was roughly £37,000, a pool of wealth drawn from about 200 investors. Most expected they would see returns within 5 to 7 years. Most could not have imagined, could never have dared to imagine, what their company would become. In the warehouses near the docks, where the smell of spice hung thick in the air, men began to prepare. The company's directors met to plan the first expedition. Ships would need to be purchased or built, supplies gathered, crew hired, captains chosen. A voyage to the East Indies took months, perhaps longer. The route around Africa was still not entirely mapped. The winds and currents had to be calculated. The crew would face scurvy, a disease that rotted the gums and caused bones to weaken, a danger that no one yet understood how to prevent. They would face storms that could splinter a wooden hull in minutes. They would arrive in hostile waters, in lands ruled by sultans and emperors who had no particular interest in trading with English merchants. The entire enterprise was a gamble of breathtaking proportions. And yet the papers were signed, the shares changed hands. The slow machinery of capitalism, still in its infancy, had begun to turn. The warehouses were filled with goods to trade, woolens from England, metals, glass, the surplus goods of the British Isles that might interest Asian courts or Asian merchants. By March of 1601, the first fleet was nearly ready. 5 ships, including the flagship Red Dragon, would sail under the command of Captain James Lancaster, one of England's most experienced navigators. They would carry perhaps 200 men, along with the hopes of 200 investors who had no way of knowing whether their money would return at all, or whether it would simply disappear into the vast indifference of the Indian Ocean. In the darkness before dawn, as London slept, those ships would have bobbed gently at anchor, ready. The crews would sleep aboard, if they could sleep at all. The officers would review their maps and calculations one final time. The merchants who had paid for all this would return to their homes, to their wives and their ledgers, to the ordinary business of living, waiting for news that might take a year or more to arrive. In the spice warehouses, the smell of distant lands seemed to grow stronger, as if the very air knew that something was about to change, as if the quiet revolution of private power, disguised as commerce, was about to begin its long, slow march across the world. If you've ever wondered how a private company could gradually come to rule nearly a fifth of the world's population, wielding its own armies, minting its own currency, signing treaties as though it were a sovereign nation, then you're already touching on one of history's most peculiar and consequential stories. The East India Company didn't conquer empires through the thunder of righteous warfare or the proclamations of kings, at least not at first. It arrived almost quietly, with ledgers and contracts, with patience that seemed almost to exhale across decades rather than compress itself into dramatic moments. And perhaps that patience, that mercantile caution dressed up as opportunity, made it all the more transformative. If you find yourself drawn to these kinds of slow, intricate passages through the architecture of how power actually assembled itself, not through legend or mythology, but through the mundane machinery of profit and compromise and incremental reach, then there's an entire library of these quietest turning points waiting to unfold here. These are the moments when the course of continents shifted not with fanfare, but with a merchant's careful handshake, or an ink signature on a document that seemed to promise merely commercial advantage and somehow begat dominion instead. Each of these stories moves at its own gentle pace, each one inviting you into the corridors of history, where the most consequential changes often happened in the smallest handwriting. Now, returning to our candle-lit docks, and the men who would build something unprecedented, the England of Queen Elizabeth's final years was a nation obsessed, truly obsessed, with spices. In an era when refrigeration was nothing but a dream stored somewhere between alchemy and prayer, spices meant more than flavor. They meant preservation, they meant wealth, they meant the difference between surviving a winter and starving through it. The very word spice carried the weight of distant lands. Nutmeg, cloves, mace, pepper. These came from islands so far away they seemed mythical to most English people. And for nearly a century, the Portuguese and then increasingly the Dutch had controlled nearly every avenue of access to them. The Portuguese had spent generations establishing a maritime route around the Cape of Good Hope, their ships appearing like ghosts from the mist, only to vanish again with their holds full of treasures. The Dutch, meanwhile, had begun to use their superior naval technology and ruthless efficiency to edge out even the Portuguese, consolidating their grip on the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, with an intensity that bordered on ferocious. England, though a rising power, found itself nearly entirely locked out. Here was a nation with ships and ambition and merchants burning with the desire to cut themselves a portion of these impossible profits, yet barred from the table by more established rivals and their fortified positions across Asia. It created a peculiar hunger, the kind of hunger that pushes merchants to write proposals, to seek royal patronage, to believe that if they could just organize themselves properly, if they could pool their resources and secure official sanction, they might break through the Portuguese and Dutch blockade. The spice trade of that era operated almost like a fever dream in the minds of London merchants. A single voyage that succeeded could return profits of 300, sometimes 400%. A single voyage. Those numbers circulated in the taverns and counting houses like scripture. Imagine owning a share of such a venture, a modest investment that might, in the span of 2 or 3 years at sea, transform your entire circumstance. And yet the risks were equally enormous. Ships disappeared, crews fell to disease. Voyages that began with hopeful manifest lists sometimes returned with the manifest nearly empty of human cargo. The mathematics of the spice trade were as brutal as they were tantalizing. Throughout the 1590s, various groups of English merchants had been quietly organizing, talking, planning. Some had even attempted voyages eastward, though most had ended in catastrophe or mere disappointment. But the obsession only deepened. By 1599 and into 1600, a more formal coalition began to crystallize around a group of London merchants and investors who believed they could do what Elizabeth's earlier adventurers had not quite managed: establish a permanent, organized, sustained English presence in the East Indies. They began to gather capital. They drafted petitions to the Crown. They spoke among themselves of the necessity not just of a venture, but of a company, a joint stock enterprise that could pool resources across many investors, spreading both risk and reward. This was a new kind of thinking in England, though the Dutch had already begun experimenting with precisely these structures. What these merchants were proposing was, in essence, the outsourcing of imperial ambition to private enterprise. The Crown, perpetually in need of funds and wary of direct expenditure, could grant a charter, a monopoly on English trade with a certain region, and thereby encourage merchants to risk their own capital in pursuit of national glory and commercial expansion. The Crown would gain prestige, expanded trade, greater wealth flowing into its treasury, all without bearing the primary financial burden. The merchants would gain protection from domestic rivals and enormous potential profits. It was an elegant bargain, though neither side quite understood yet just how much power they were placing in the hands of this commercial entity. That power would only become visible when it had already been exercised, when the company had already begun its slow, almost imperceptible transformation from trader to ruler. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That story unfolds over a century and a half, in increments so small they often went unnoticed by anyone but the participants themselves. The air was thick with possibility and uncertainty as the year 1600 approached. Elizabeth was aging. The future of England itself felt less settled than it would become under her successors. And into this uncertainty stepped a group of men with a petition, a dream, and a proposal that would eventually reshape the entire relationship between commerce and empire, between the private interests of merchants and the geopolitical interests of nations. They didn't know yet that they were birthing something unprecedented. They believed, more modestly, that they were merely organizing themselves to capture a share of the spice trade. How often does history unfold in precisely this way, with the most consequential decisions disguised as simple, practical business arrangements? The transformation, when it came, would be so gradual that it would be nearly invisible to those living through it. To understand why a group of London merchants would gather in the year 1600 and stake their fortunes on distant seas, we must first breathe in the world they inherited, a world obsessed, almost fevered, with the taste of things they could not make themselves, spices, not merely the garnish of a pleasant meal, but the currency of desire, the preservative of empire, the very substance that made meat edible when winter stretched long and cellars grew thin. Black pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace. These were not luxuries in the way we might now understand luxury. They were necessities wrapped in mystery, grown only in archipelagos so remote that their very existence seemed half legendary to the merchants and nobles of England. For nearly 2 centuries, the Portuguese had held something close to a monopoly on this trade. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, and then through the exploratory ambitions of men like Vasco da Gama, Portugal had seized the sea routes around Africa, muscled their way into the Indian Ocean, and established a network of trading posts and fortified settlements that funneled the spices of the East directly into European hands. It was a feat of remarkable audacity and navigational courage, and it had made Portugal rich beyond the imagination of landlocked kingdoms. For a time, there was almost no other way to obtain these goods except through Portuguese intermediaries, and they priced them accordingly. A pound of cloves might cost as much as a small estate. A vial of nutmeg could ransom a merchant's daughter. England, in the age of Elizabeth, chafed under this arrangement. Here was a kingdom that had begun to feel its strength, that had defeated the Spanish Armada, that had established itself as a maritime power of consequence, and yet it found itself shut out from one of the most profitable trades in the world. The spices flowed through Portuguese hands, or through the complex networks of the Venetian and Genoese traders who dealt in goods already passed through Islamic middlemen, Ottoman administrators, and 1,000 tolls and tariffs. The cost was astronomical. The England of Elizabeth's later years wanted direct access. It wanted to break the Portuguese stranglehold. It wanted, quite simply, to sail directly to the source and bring those precious aromatics home on English ships. But the Portuguese were not the only obstacle. In the final years of Elizabeth's reign, a new rival had emerged from the maritime trading posts and merchant networks of the Low Countries. The Dutch, organized, disciplined, and ferociously ambitious, had begun to look eastward with the same hunger that burned in English hearts. They had not accepted Portuguese supremacy. They had begun to probe the sea routes themselves, to seek their own passages to the Indies, to imagine a Dutch-controlled network of trading posts that might rival or even surpass the Portuguese achievement. The Dutch East India Company, when it would form in 1602, was still a few years away, but the ambition was already taking shape in the counting houses of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. Here, then, was the moment. England faced a world in which the Portuguese held the old power. The Dutch were gathering their strength for a challenge, and in between these two great forces, London merchants saw their opportunity. It was a fractured, contested marketplace, but it was also, and this is perhaps the crucial point, it was no longer entirely closed. Rumours and reports had begun to circulate in English trading circles about the real geography of the spice trade, about the actual sources and prices in those distant eastern markets. Through fragmentary accounts, through conversations with Portuguese deserters and Dutch informants, through the kind of intelligence that flowed through the networks of international merchants, a picture had emerged. Yes, the Portuguese charged extraordinary prices, but only because they maintained such strict control over supply. If one could reach the archipelagos directly, if one could establish a trading post even in a remote corner of the Spice Islands, the profits would dwarf anything currently imaginable. The Portuguese were not guardians of an infinite supply. They were gatekeepers of a finite resource, and gates, as every merchant knows, can be breached. This was the hunger that animated the conversations in London counting houses as the 16th century drew toward its close. Not mere greed, though there was certainly greed enough, but a kind of rational hunger, the recognition that an entire category of wealth lay just beyond reach, separated from England not by laws of nature, but by geography, by Portuguese naval power, and by the sheer difficulty of the voyage itself. The Elizabethan merchant adventurers who began to conceive of an organized assault on this monopoly were not dreamers, but rather hard-eyed men of accounts and ledgers who understood that the risk, however vast, was proportionate to the reward. One successful voyage could return profits of 300, 400, even 500%. A man could invest a modest fortune and return, if fortune favored him, wealthy beyond the dreams of his provincial ancestors. The question that animated these conversations was deceptively simple. Could England organize itself sufficiently to challenge not merely the Portuguese system, but the emerging Dutch threat? Could a group of London merchants, with the blessing and protection of the Crown, pool their resources, equip a fleet, navigate the treacherous waters around Africa and across the Indian Ocean, survive the perils of tropical disease and shipwreck and hostile encounter, and establish themselves firmly enough in the Spice Islands to begin bringing home meaningful quantities of cloves and nutmeg and pepper? The Portuguese had done it. The Dutch were beginning to attempt it. Why not England? Why should the spices of the Indies flow past English ports, while English merchants grew fat on the scraps of re-exported continental trade? It was in this climate of competitive hunger and rational ambition, then, that a group of London merchants began to lay plans in the final years of Elizabeth's reign. They were not yet thinking in terms of empire. They were thinking, quite straightforwardly, in terms of pepper and profit. They wanted to break into a trade that seemed fantastically lucrative, that promised to remake the fortunes of whoever could secure a foothold in it, and that currently lay in the hands of rivals, foreign rivals who had no particular love for England and no reason to yield their advantages voluntarily. The stage was being set, in other words, for one of history's great acts of commercial ambition. A group of private merchants was about to petition the Crown for permission to attempt something that had never been attempted by an English company before: the establishment of a permanent, organized, well-funded trading network in the distant Indies. They could not have known, in those preliminary conversations, what would eventually grow from that seed. They were thinking of pepper and cloves. They could not have imagined that their venture would, within 2 centuries, transform them from traders into conquerors, from merchants into rulers. But the hunger was real, the opportunity was real, and the moment was at hand. And so it was that in the year of 1600, when Queen Elizabeth had only months left to reign, a particular gathering took place in the city of London that would set in motion one of the most extraordinary transformations the world would ever witness. Not with fanfare or proclamation, but with the careful, measured choreography of merchants who understood that great fortunes are built not in moments of passion, but in moments of patient calculation. The men who gathered possessed names that carried weight in the commercial circles of London. Names like Sir Thomas Smythe, a seasoned merchant with decades of trading experience behind him, and Sir John Popham, the Lord Chief Justice, whose legal mind would shape the company's constitutional foundation. There was also Sebastian Cabot, whose father had once sought the Northwest Passage, whose very name carried the romance of exploration. These were gentlemen investors, many of them already wealthy, who had come together with a conviction that burned quietly but persistently in the minds of England's merchant class, that the riches of the East, the spices that made food palatable through long winters, the silks that adorned nobility, the dyes that coloured cloth, all of these treasures did not inherently belong to the Portuguese or the Dutch. England had the ships, England had the capital, England had the hunger. What England needed was permission, and on the last day of the year, on the 31st of December in the year 1600, that permission arrived in the form of a charter, a document written on parchment, sealed with the great seal of the realm, and signed, almost quietly, by the hand of the aged Queen Elizabeth. It was a signature that would prove far more consequential than anyone present could have fully grasped, though it is worth noting that Queen Elizabeth herself was a seasoned observer of commerce and power, and would not have affixed her seal to such a document without understanding its weight. The charter itself was remarkable in its implications, though its language was measured and legalistic, as such documents always are. It granted to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, that was their formal name, though it would eventually be shortened to the East India Company, the exclusive right to trade in the East. Not merely to attempt trade, but to hold a monopoly. No other English merchant could trade in the waters east of the Cape of Good Hope without the company's explicit permission. This was the fundamental grant of power, the first key that would unlock so much that followed. But beyond the monopoly itself, the charter contained something even more radical, and it is here where we might pause to reflect on how the modern world was actually born, often in the most unremarkable language, in the most bureaucratic of forms. The charter granted the company the right to establish its own government in those distant lands, to make laws, to govern those who worked for it, to establish military forces and to fortify settlements, to negotiate treaties with local rulers. These were powers that had traditionally belonged to kings alone, or at least to entities clearly subordinate to kings. Yet here was a private corporation, for that is what the company was, owned by its shareholders, run for profit, being granted the prerogatives of sovereignty. The shareholders themselves numbered among the merchant elite and gentry of England. There were perhaps some 215 of them in that first instance, men who had committed capital to the venture, who expected dividends if the enterprise proved successful, and who received in exchange a piece of ownership proportional to their investment. Some committed modest sums. Others, including the company's first governor, Thomas Smythe, committed substantial fortunes. It was, in many respects, the birth of the modern joint stock company, that curious invention by which risk could be distributed among many investors, and by which a large enterprise could be funded without requiring the resources of a monarch alone. The first court of directors was established to oversee the company's operations. These were men who would meet regularly. We might imagine them in a room lit by candles, poring over maps and manifests, discussing the outfitting of ships and the hiring of factors who would represent the company in distant ports. They were not employees in the modern sense, though some of them held other positions as well. They were shareholders who served without salary, driven by the prospect of profit and by the sheer fascination of the undertaking. Among them was the company's secretary, who kept records, and a treasurer who managed the company's accounts, a system of bureaucratic oversight that would itself prove to be one of the company's greatest innovations. The machinery of this new organization was in many ways deliberately constructed to move slowly, to deliberate carefully before committing resources. Decisions had to pass through layers of discussion. Reports came back from trading posts months and months after events had transpired, requiring that decisions made in London often addressed situations that had already changed dramatically on the other side of the world. This very sluggishness would prove, paradoxically, to be a source of institutional stability. The company could not react with the impulsive violence of a monarch, nor with the rapid decision-making of a military command. It was a machine designed for commerce, which meant it was designed for patience. One might wonder what the Queen herself thought of this charter in those final months of her life. Did she see in it a threat to her own authority, a dangerous devolution of power to merchants? Or did she view it pragmatically, as so many of her decisions were made, recognizing that England's wealth and standing depended on its ability to compete in the emerging global trade networks? The Queen was perhaps the first truly modern monarch in her understanding that state power rested increasingly on commercial wealth. She had licensed privateers. She had granted monopolies and charters to various trading ventures. She understood that in the world that was emerging, the nations that would matter would be those that could project economic power across vast distances. And yet, even she could not have fully anticipated where this particular charter would lead. She could not have foreseen that this company, founded by merchants meeting in London, granted the exclusive right to trade in the East, would eventually grow so vast in scope that it would govern millions of people, command armies larger than those of most European nations, and transform the political geography of Asia itself. She signed a piece of parchment, gave permission for English merchants to trade, and in doing so, helped set in motion forces that would reshape the world for the next 3 centuries. The charter was published and announced. Shares were offered for sale to those with the capital and the faith to invest. Ships were begun to be built or commandeered for the company's service. Plans were laid, routes were studied. The machinery began, ever so slowly, to move. And in those quiet offices of London, lit by candlelight, with the Thames flowing past carrying the ships of many nations, a new form of power was being born, one that would prove to be neither purely commercial nor purely political, but something altogether novel. The power of the corporation, an entity that could accumulate wealth and authority, persist beyond the lifespan of any individual founder, and act with a combination of ruthlessness and bureaucratic caution that would prove nearly impossible for traditional enemies to counter or understand. The ships that sailed from England in those first years were neither large nor particularly well suited to the journey they had been given. The Susan Constant, the Hector, the Ascension, names that sound almost pastoral to modern ears, though they belonged to vessels of timber and canvas that would creak and groan for months across waters no English merchant had carefully mapped before. When the first expedition departed in December of 1600, the men aboard understood that they were embarking on something almost entirely unknown, a voyage that would take them not toward the established routes of Portuguese traders hugging the African coast, but south and east into the Indian Ocean itself, where the maps ended in blank parchment and speculation. The journey itself was a slow compression of time and space, days melting into weeks, and weeks into the strange rhythm of life at sea. The ships moved at the pace of wind and current, sometimes becalmed for days in waters so still that the sails hung limp, and the men would sit in the oppressive heat, watching the horizon for any sign of breeze. And when the wind did come, it often brought storms that tossed the vessels like wooden toys, testing the skill of pilots who had learned their craft in the calmer waters of European trade routes. The hold of each ship was packed with goods meant for trade: tin and lead, broadcloth and pewter, the tangible offerings of English manufacture, meant to convince distant merchants that English goods held value in Asian markets. No one quite knew if they would. But what haunted these voyages more than the violence of storms was something far more insidious, something that worked slowly through the bodies of the sailors over months at sea. Scurvy. The disease emerged gradually, almost invisibly at first, a swelling of the gums, a weariness that seemed disproportionate to the labor, teeth that grew loose in their sockets, wounds that refused to heal. The men afflicted with it would often sit on deck in the tropical sun, looking toward the horizon with a kind of blank despair, understanding only dimly that their bodies were consuming themselves, that something within the nature of their preserved food, the dried biscuits hard as wood, the salted meat, the absence of anything green, was slowly unmaking them from within. The company's records speak almost matter-of-factly of the mortality. Ship's logs noting that sailors would be buried at sea with the same terseness one might use to record the consumption of rations. The first voyage lost perhaps a third of its crew to this invisible enemy before it ever reached the Indies. The sea itself seemed hostile in ways that went beyond weather. There were calms that lasted for weeks, leaving the ships suspended in motionless equatorial heat, the wood swelling and the tar melting from the seams. There were sudden tropical squalls that arose without warning, and there were the steady, almost personal enmities of Dutch and Portuguese vessels, which would sometimes appear on the horizon like predators that had caught the scent of competition. The company's first merchants were often merchant adventurers in the truest sense, men who had invested their own money and reputation in this enterprise, and who understood that failure meant not merely the loss of profit, but the loss of everything. When finally the ships reached the Indonesian archipelago, the Spice Islands themselves, the Moluccas, and the islands surrounding them, there was a moment almost of shock at arrival. The waters here were shallow and treacherous, studded with reefs and rocks that were not always visible. The islands themselves rose green and impossibly lush from the sea, heavy with vegetation that seemed almost aggressive in its abundance, and the air itself felt different, thick with moisture and the smell of growing things that English nostrils had never encountered. This was the source of the wealth that had drawn them here. Nutmeg, cloves, mace, spices that in London commanded prices almost equivalent to gold, that were preserved in the apothecaries' shops like precious medicines, that could transform the plain food of a wealthy household into something approaching luxury. But the islands belonged already to other powers, most particularly the Portuguese, who had established themselves here decades earlier and who did not welcome competition. The earliest English expeditions found themselves in a delicate, often hostile negotiation with existing monopolies. There were instances of violence, of ships seized, of English merchants imprisoned or executed. There was the constant threat that a larger force would appear, that the Portuguese fleet would overwhelm whatever small defensive capability the company could assemble. And there was the deeper difficulty that the Dutch, realizing the value of what was here, had begun to move into the region themselves with greater force and better organized support, making it increasingly clear that the Indies were contested ground where possession was 9/10 of armed strength. The first voyages produced modest returns, if any at all, when you accounted for the cost of the ships, the wages of the sailors, the loss of men to disease. There is something that might be called fragile hope in the letters and reports that came back to London from these early factors. The company's representatives stationed in remote trading posts built of wood and palm thatch, surrounded by waters and forests they did not understand. They speak of contracts negotiated, of spice-laden holds, of the promise of greater profits in future years when supply lines were established and the initial uncertainties resolved. The shareholders who had funded this venture were being asked to wait, to trust in a future return that seemed increasingly uncertain as news arrived of losses and disappointments. Yet there was also something else beginning to form in these early years, something that would prove more significant than any single voyage or spice purchase. There was the establishment of the company as a permanent institution, a body that did not depend on the success or failure of any single merchant or any single voyage, but that could absorb losses and continue forward, reinvesting profits as they came, learning from failures, adapting its strategies. The factors stationed in the Indies were beginning to form networks, to build relationships with local merchants and rulers, to understand the politics and economics of the Asian trade in ways that European merchants sitting in London could never quite grasp. And slowly, almost imperceptibly in those early years, the company was beginning to shift from being a merchant enterprise focused on buying and selling goods to being something far stranger, a territorial and political actor, a power in its own right, though it did not yet fully understand what it was becoming. Yet those early voyages to the Spice Islands, for all their promise, had revealed something troubling to the company's merchants. The distances were immense, the losses were severe. The Dutch, meanwhile, were consolidating their grip on the archipelago with ruthless efficiency, and the Portuguese before them had spent a century fortifying their position. The investors in London began to wonder whether the spice trade, however fragrant with profit, might be a game already lost to players who had arrived first and dug in deepest. And so, quietly, without fanfare or grand proclamation, the company's attention turned westward across the Indian Ocean, toward the vast subcontinent of India itself. This was not entirely new thinking. Traders had whispered about Indian cottons for years, fabrics so fine they seemed to hold light itself. The dyes were incomparable. The volumes, if a merchant could secure them, were boundless. But India presented a puzzle entirely different from the island spice trade. It was not a fractured collection of sultanates and rajas squabbling over resources. India, in the early 17th century, lay largely under the dominion of the Mughal Empire, one of the greatest powers on earth, a civilization of such complexity and wealth that even the most ambitious English merchant might be forgiven for feeling small upon arrival. The Mughal court at Agra and Delhi had existed for nearly a century by the time the East India Company began to seriously contemplate entering Indian markets. Emperor Akbar, who had ruled with a kind of enlightened pragmatism, had only recently passed from the world. His successor, Jahangir, now held the throne, a man of sophisticated tastes, patron of the arts, collector of curiosities from distant lands. This was a court that spoke Persian, Turkish, and Sanskrit. It commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Its treasury overflowed with jewels and gold. Its administrative system, for all its ornate complexity, functioned with a precision that made European kingdoms seem like provinces of children playing at governance. How could a handful of English merchants, bearing letters of introduction and modest gifts, expect to conduct business in such a realm? The answer lay not in force, but in something far more delicate, the art of petition and persuasion. The company's early representatives who travelled to India understood, or quickly came to understand, that they could not bully their way into trade rights. The Mughals had no need of English goods. They had no hunger for English tin or English wool. What they might want, what they might be persuaded to want, was access to silver, precious metals from the Americas filtered through European hands, and the exotic curiosities that Western merchants might procure. More importantly, they wanted reliable trading partners who would respect the established order and not attempt to seize territory or impose their customs upon the land. The company's early agents in Indian ports worked with a kind of patient diplomacy that would have seemed almost humble to observers back in London. They did not arrive with armies. They arrived with credentials, with patience, with a willingness to lease warehouses and hire local merchants and craftspeople. They learned the languages, or hired men who knew them. They studied the rhythms of monsoon seasons, which governed when ships could safely sail and when monsoons would bring goods inland. They adopted certain customs, wore modified versions of local dress, and cultivated relationships with Mughal officials and local power brokers whose permission was necessary before a single bale of cloth could be bought or sold. The very concept of the factory took on a particular meaning in this Indian context. A factory was not a place where goods were manufactured, as the word might suggest to modern ears. Rather, it was a fortified warehouse, a trading post, a small compound where merchants and clerks and warehouse workers conducted the business of commerce. It was a refuge, but also a statement. Each factory represented a tiny foothold of English presence within a foreign empire, and each one required negotiation, payment, and the granting of formal permission from whatever local authority held sway. Surat, on the Gujarat coast, became the first great prize. This port city had long served as a gateway to Indian textiles and a departure point for pilgrims traveling to Mecca. When the company finally secured permission to establish a factory there in 1608, the significance was profound though quiet. It meant that England, through its merchants, had official recognition from the Mughal authorities. It meant that goods could be legally purchased, warehoused, and shipped. It meant that English merchants could walk the streets under a kind of protective umbrella of imperial sanction. The early years at Surat were not, however, entirely peaceful. Portuguese ships patrolled the same waters, and they had no intention of allowing English vessels to trade without interference. There were skirmishes, boarding actions, moments of violence that seemed to contradict the diplomatic mission of the company. And yet the company persisted, because the merchants understood something fundamental. In the long view, in the structure of the Mughal world, they were not enemies to be destroyed. They were supplicants to be regulated, allowed to function within carefully circumscribed bounds, useful to the empire as one element among many in the great machinery of trade. The Mughal emperors, from their perspective, saw no reason to grant exclusive trading rights to any European power. The Portuguese had been in India for over a century, and they had never become masters of the realm. Why should the English be different? Why should they be granted monopolies or special privileges? The answer, of course, lay in the future, in the slow erosion of Mughal power and the patient accumulation of English influence. But in these early decades of the 17th century, that future was unimaginable. The Mughal Empire seemed as eternal as the monsoon itself, as inevitable as the turning of seasons. The company's merchants understood that their position was precarious and dependent entirely on the goodwill of the emperors and the local governors, and so they bent their energies toward one task, becoming indispensable. They learned to speak the languages of commerce in registers that local merchants could understand. They paid their taxes, levies, and duties. They cultivated relationships with powerful families. They brought goods that proved valuable in the Indian economy. Silver bullion, primarily, which the Indian economy seemed to absorb in endless quantities, fueling a kind of monetary inflation that enriched merchants and destabilized kingdoms in equal measure. And the Indian merchants, in turn, recognized opportunity. Here were foreigners who could bring goods from lands beyond the Arabian Sea, who had ships capable of long-distance voyages, who represented potential markets for Indian cottons and silks and indigo. It was not a relationship of conquest or domination, not yet. It was a relationship of mutual, cautious advantage, conducted in the shade of the Mughal authority that blessed all exchange with its imperial seal. The Portuguese had held their spice routes with the force of small armies, and the Dutch were learning to do the same, but the English merchants understood that in the vast interior of Asia, military might alone could accomplish nothing. What they needed was permission, the kind of permission that came not from cannons, but from the careful negotiations of diplomats who understood that the greatest empires of the world were governed by men who valued ceremony and precedent as deeply as they valued profit. By the early years of the 17th century, The Mughal Empire under Emperor Akbar had reached a kind of golden age. The empire stretched across the Indian subcontinent with a vastness that made even the grandest European kingdoms seem like provincial towns by comparison. And when Akbar's son Jahangir ascended to the throne in 1605, the nature of European trade with India began to shift in ways that no one could have fully predicted. Jahangir was, by most accounts, a patron of the arts and a man of cultivated tastes. He loved painting and poetry. He was also a man of considerable pragmatism, and he understood that allowing European merchants to establish fixed trading posts within his empire could provide valuable revenue and access to goods that his own merchants might not easily reach. The English East India Company, having survived its fragile early voyages and learned hard lessons about the distance, the storms, the disease that claimed so many sailors between London and the Indies, began to view India itself as something more than a way station. The Spice Islands remained the ultimate prize, the source of nutmeg and cloves and mace that commanded such extraordinary prices in European markets. But those islands were increasingly dominated by the Dutch, who had no interest in sharing their profits or their territorial claims. India, by contrast, was a continent. It was vast enough, perhaps, for more than one European merchant company to establish itself. It was also, in a manner that the European powers did not yet fully comprehend, the center of its own great trading networks that stretched across the Indian Ocean to Persia and the Red Sea, to the coasts of Africa, to the interior routes that led to China itself. The granting of trading rights in Mughal India came not through military conquest, but through the ancient mechanism of the firman. A firman was an imperial decree, a document sealed and signed by the emperor himself, granting specific rights and privileges to particular merchants or trading companies. For the East India Company, obtaining these firmans became the essential key to establishing themselves as something more than occasional visitors who might trade briefly and then depart. With a firman, a company could establish permanent trading posts, known as factories, where goods could be accumulated and stored, and where factors, as the resident agents were called, could conduct business with local merchants and cultivate the relationships that made trade prosper. The process of obtaining a firman was not swift. It required patience and the kind of careful diplomacy that the early company merchants had to learn through trial and error. Jahangir was not a man to be rushed. He was surrounded by courtiers and ministers, each of whom had their own interests and their own opinions about whether European traders should be permitted to expand their activities within the empire. Some of his officials viewed European merchants as potentially useful sources of revenue. Others saw them as troublesome outsiders whose presence in Indian ports might disrupt established trading networks and traditional relationships between merchants and the crown. The man who came to embody the English company's diplomatic efforts in the Mughal court was Sir Thomas Roe. Roe arrived in India in 1615, having been appointed as an ambassador by King James I himself. He was a man of considerable learning and social standing, a diplomat rather than a merchant, and his mission was to secure from Emperor Jahangir the formal grants that would allow the East India Company to trade freely throughout the empire without the constant threat of expulsion or the imposition of arbitrary taxes. The meeting between Roe and the Mughal emperor became, in its own way, one of the pivotal moments in the history of the company. Though no cannons were fired and no armies mobilized, it was instead a meeting conducted through the protocols of court ceremony, through careful language and gifts, and the kind of patient negotiation that could stretch across months. Roe had to learn the customs of the court. He had to understand the proper forms of address, the protocols for approaching the emperor, the way that matters of state were discussed through layers of intermediaries and ministers rather than in direct conversation. Jahangir, for his part, seems to have taken a liking to Roe. The two men, by the accounts that survive from this period, achieved a degree of personal rapport that was unusual for the time. Jahangir was curious about the far western world from which Roe had travelled, about the power and the wealth of England, about the nature of European trade and European monarchs. In return, Roe presented gifts that had been carefully selected in London, objects of craftsmanship and luxury that demonstrated the wealth and the sophistication of the European kingdom he represented. The outcome of these months of negotiation and courtly ceremony was a series of firmans that gave the East India Company explicit permission to trade at multiple ports along the Indian coast, most notably at Surat, which would become one of the most important trading centres for the company in India. These were not grants of territory, at least not initially. They were grants of trade rights, permission to establish factories and warehouses, to hire local merchants and brokers, to bring goods in and out of the ports without undue interference. What made these firmans so valuable was their permanence. They were not temporary permissions that could be revoked at the whim of a local governor. They were decrees from the emperor himself, which carried with them a weight of authority that extended throughout the empire. With these documents in hand, with the imperial seals impressed upon them, the East India Company's vision of what it might become began to subtly reshape itself. It was no longer primarily a trading company searching for spices in distant islands. It was becoming something more, a territorial power in miniature, a company with official standing in one of the world's greatest empires. The factories that it would now establish were not merely commercial enterprises. They were small autonomous communities, led by factors who answered to the company in London, who accumulated not just goods, but also knowledge of local languages, local customs, local politics. The symbolic weight of Roe's audience with Jahangir should not be underestimated, though it is easy to miss when reading about it now, centuries later. What occurred was a recognition by one of the world's greatest empires that the merchants of England, a small island nation on the edge of Europe, possessed something of value, something worth opening the doors of an empire to accommodate. The documents that Roe carried back to England, the firmans with their imperial seals, represented a kind of legitimacy that no European trading company had yet achieved in Asia. They were not tokens of conquest. They were tokens of acceptance, of a place carved out within an existing system of power and commerce. And yet, even as Roe negotiated these grants, even as the company's representatives in Indian ports began to construct their brick and timber factories, to hire local workers and agents, there was something quietly shifting in the background. The granting of trade rights was not permanent, though it seemed to be. Jahangir's authority, though vast, was not unchanging. The mechanisms of Mughal imperial power, which had seemed so stable and so permanent from Roe's perspective, were already showing subtle signs of the great transformations that would eventually hollow them out from within. But that lay years ahead, decades even. For now, there was only the satisfaction of a negotiation concluded, a foothold secured, and the beginning of something that would grow far beyond what any man in those years could have imagined. By the early decades of the 17th century, the East India Company had begun to establish something far more substantial than the fleeting anchorages of its earliest voyages. These were not grand fortresses, not yet. Instead, they were called factories, a word drawn from the Portuguese, meaning simply a place where factors, or agents, lived and worked. And in the warm, humid air of the Indian coast, these humble compounds would become the quiet foundations of an empire that few could have imagined. Surat was perhaps the first true foothold. Picture it now, in the 1610s, as the monsoon winds shift and the Arabian Sea transforms from violent to merely churning. The factory there began as little more than a warehouse fronting the water, its thick walls built not from stone, but from local brick and lime mortar, designed to withstand both the salt spray and the periodic flooding that monsoons brought. Inside, clerks bent over ledgers by daylight, filtering through high windows, recording the weight of pepper, the count of indigo bales, the price of cotton cloth in careful, slanting handwriting that would sometimes blur in the humidity. The company men who lived there, and they were mostly English and Scottish merchants, many of them young, far from home, occupied simple quarters above or adjacent to the counting house, where the air hung thick and unchanging, even when the sea breeze reached the broader streets outside. What strikes the imagination now, across the centuries, is the absolute ordinariness of these daily rhythms, set against the extraordinary significance of what they represented. A clerk named John would rise before dawn, as was custom, perhaps wash in water from a well that had been drawn the night before. He would take a simple breakfast, perhaps bread, perhaps rice, depending on how long he had been in India and how fully he had adopted local customs. Then he would descend to the counting house, where the ledgers awaited him, page after page, where every transaction, every shipment, every rupee gained or spent had to be inscribed in triplicate and dispatched back to London on the next fleet. The correspondence alone was staggering. A single factor might write dozens of letters in a day, each one sealed with wax and filed carefully, knowing that his performance would be judged by men he had never met, sitting in a London office perhaps 2 years' sailing distance away. The warehouse itself was a study in controlled chaos. Spices arrived in burlap and hemp sacking, their fragrance so overwhelming that newcomers to the factory would sometimes find themselves disoriented by the smell alone. Pepper, which was the true prize in those early years, was sorted and graded with an almost obsessive care. Black pepper from the Malabar coast was not the same as white pepper from Java. The company's agents had to understand these distinctions intimately, for their reputation and their employer's profit depended upon it. Bolts of cotton cloth came down from the interior, woven in towns whose names meant nothing to the English, but which produced fabrics of such fineness and durability that they would soon become the most valuable trade goods the company could possess. Indigo arrived in pressed cakes, each one requiring careful inspection for color and purity. Saltpeter, that strange and essential substance used for gunpowder, was packed in large quantities, for the demand in Europe seemed endless. The rhythm of Surat, and indeed of all the company's Indian factories, was not random. It was governed by forces that no man could control, the monsoon winds themselves. Between May and September, the seas became treacherous. The sky itself seemed to lower and darken, and no ship could safely make the voyage between India and England. This meant that everything had to be coordinated around this natural calendar. The factory would spend months receiving goods, sorting them, preparing them for the voyage that would occur only when the weather broke. As October approached and the rains began to ease, there would be a visible quickening of pace. Goods would be loaded into smaller boats that would carry them out to the waiting merchant ships, now anchored in the roadstead at some distance from shore. Men would labour in teams, using block and tackle to hoist bales aboard, and the factor in charge would stand watching, checking off items against his manifest, making certain that nothing was lost, nothing damaged, nothing stolen. Madras, established somewhat later, around 1639, followed a similar pattern but with its own particular character. It lay on the Coromandel coast, where the beaches were narrower, the water shallower, and the logistics of loading and unloading cargo presented even more formidable challenges. Here, cotton was the dominant good. The surrounding regions produced cloth of such exceptional quality that agents would travel inland to negotiate directly with weavers and merchants, forging relationships that would span decades. A single factor might return to the same village multiple times, building trust with the same family of merchants, understanding their needs and their capacity, and thereby securing a steady supply of goods. These networks became invisible but crucial arteries of the company's trade, connecting English merchants on the coast to the vast interior of the subcontinent. Bombay, when it finally passed to English hands through marriage in 1661, was almost an afterthought at first. Its harbour was superb, but the island was marshy, fever-ridden, and seemed less immediately profitable than Madras or Surat. Yet its strategic position on the western coast, its proximity to spice routes, and the political circumstances that would unfold over the coming decades would eventually make it the most significant of all the company's Indian bases. In these early years, though, it was a place of slow construction, of fort building, of drainage and mosquito-haunted nights. Men came there and fell ill with alarming frequency. The mortality rate was such that many of the company's agents resigned themselves to a shortened span of years in India, calculating that if they could survive 5 or 6 years without dying, they might return to England with enough profit to establish themselves respectably in society. The daily life in all these factories shared certain characteristics. There was a hierarchy, always. At the top was the chief factor, a man of considerable authority who reported directly to the Court of Directors in London and who wielded quasi-judicial powers over the company's servants and sometimes over local populations as well. Below him were the factors themselves, the merchant princes of the operation, who managed the business of buying and selling. Then came the writers, as the clerks were called, young men learning the trade, keeping their meticulous records. There were also craftspeople, carpenters, masons, coopers, who maintained the physical structures of the factory and repaired the goods that arrived damaged. And there were servants, some of them enslaved, more often simply hired locally or brought from other parts of India, who performed the manual labour. The social life of the factory was constrained, but not without its consolations. The factors would gather in the evening when the work was done, perhaps sharing a meal of European food laboriously prepared at great expense, or gradually learning to enjoy the curries and rice that were more readily available. They would write letters home, expressing nostalgia for England, anxiety about their health, hope for promotion, or for enough wealth to retire. Letters took 8 to 12 months to travel from India to London, so the correspondence was less conversation than meditation, often written knowing that news had already become history before it was read. The monsoon season itself created a different rhythm, a compressed and urgent time. As the season approached and the factory's storerooms swelled with goods ready for shipment, there would be a heightening of tension. Every transaction, every negotiation, every dispute with local merchants had to be resolved before the weather made travel impossible. Once the monsoon closed the seas, the factory was truly isolated, cut off from direct communication with London, forced to rely on the judgment and the intelligence of its own agents. Decisions about what to purchase, how much to offer, whether to expand operations or consolidate them, all had to be made without waiting for instruction from home. In this way, despite the elaborate system of correspondence and control, the factors on the ground possessed a real autonomy, a real power to shape the company's trajectory through their choices. The warehouses themselves, as the years passed, grew larger and more elaborate. Surat's might house goods worth hundreds of thousands of pounds at any given moment. The danger was constant. Fire, theft, rot, the depredations of insects and rats that seemed to multiply in the humid climate. A single disaster could erase months or years of profit. So the factors became obsessed with security, with proper storage, with the minute details of preservation. Pepper had to be kept dry. Cotton cloth had to be protected from mildew. Indigo had to be stored in conditions that prevented color loss. These were not abstract concerns. They represented the difference between wealth and ruin. The growth of these factories, quiet and unglamorous as it was, represented a fundamental shift in how commerce was being conducted. The Portuguese had built fortresses, military installations. The Dutch would do the same. But the English company, at this stage, was primarily interested in trading posts. The factories were warehouses and offices more than they were strongholds. Yet the men who worked in them were building something that would prove far more formidable than any fortress. A network of communication, supply, and financial exchange that would gradually extend its reach inland, eventually touching every corner of the Indian subcontinent and beyond. In the candle-lit offices of Leadenhall Street in London, far from the Arabian Sea and the humid trading posts where English merchants haggled over nutmeg and pepper, a different kind of machinery had begun to turn. It was a machinery made not of sail and anchor, but of paper, ink, and the careful arithmetic of men who would never set foot aboard a ship. The East India Company, in its early decades, had evolved into something unprecedented, a commercial enterprise so vast that it required an entirely new way of thinking about how business itself could be organized. When the original charter was granted in 1600, the company existed as a collective of merchants who pooled their capital and their risk. They were not yet shareholders in the way the word would come to mean by the 17th century's end, but rather adventurers, men whose names appeared on a ledger, whose investments carried both the promise of extraordinary return and the spectre of total loss. Imagine, if you will, a London coffee house in those early years, where these investors gathered to discuss the fate of distant ships that might take 2 years to return, or might never return at all. The uncertainty was absolute. The potential reward was equally immense. But as the company's voyages multiplied, as the trading posts took root along distant coasts, a problem emerged that was at first welcome, then increasingly complex. Success created capital, capital demanded management, and management, in turn, required structure. The Court of Directors was born from this necessity. Think of it as the first true corporate board, a collection of the wealthiest and most influential merchants in London who met regularly to make decisions about the distant operations of the company. These men, perhaps a dozen or two, held in their hands the power to dispatch fleets, authorize expenditures, approve the establishment of new trading posts, and determine how the profits would be distributed among the shareholders. They were, in essence, the directors of an empire that operated at the speed of monsoon winds and months-long voyages. What made this arrangement revolutionary, and what distinguished it from the monarchical trading companies that had existed before, was that the Court of Directors was itself accountable to the shareholders. The shareholders, initially a few hundred wealthy merchants, gradually expanding to include gentlemen, nobility, and even widows with modest sums to invest, held the ultimate authority. They could, in theory, vote out the directors if the company's performance disappointed them. In theory. The reality was far more intricate and often far more opaque. The shareholders met once, sometimes twice a year, in a general assembly. They voted on matters of consequence, yet their meetings were often dominated by the directors themselves, who controlled the information flow from Asia, determined what news reached London, and shaped the narrative of the company's fortunes. A shareholder in Manchester might wait months to learn the fate of a ship he had invested in. By the time he heard, the Court of Directors in London had already made and executed 3 new decisions based on that ship's arrival or failure. The bureaucratic apparatus that grew to support the company's operations was, for its time, staggeringly sophisticated. There were warehouses and their keepers, clerks who recorded every transaction, auditors who attempted to balance accounts across continents, and accountants who performed calculations on behalf of men who would never meet. In London, a separate staff maintained the administrative structure, a governor of the company, a treasurer, secretaries, and under-secretaries. Each layer of this hierarchy added another degree of separation between the decision and its consequence, between the shareholders' investment and the sailors' labor in the Indian Ocean. The directors themselves were not primarily men of action. They were men of property and calculation. Many had risen through trade, but were now content to manage their estates and their company interests from London's relatively mild climate, rather than risk themselves to tropical disease and maritime danger. They appointed factors, agents who would live in the trading posts and conduct business on their behalf. These factors, in turn, hired merchants and writers and warehouse masters and assistants. The chain of command extended across oceans, yet remained somehow unified by the flow of letters, instructions, and financial accounting that traveled in both directions aboard every homebound ship. Consider the sheer logistical challenge of operating such an enterprise. A decision made in London in spring might not reach Surat until the monsoon season of the following year. The situation the directors had addressed in their letter might have entirely transformed by then. The factor on the ground, perhaps a man of initiative and decisiveness, or perhaps a cautious bureaucrat, had to make judgments with incomplete information and limited ability to seek guidance. In some respects, the men in India were more powerful than the men in London, for they alone saw the ground as it truly was. In other respects, they were merely servants, executing the will of directors they had perhaps never met. This tension between centralized control and decentralized necessity became a permanent feature of the company's operation. It would shape policy decisions and personal fates for generations to come. The court of directors wanted to maximize profit and minimize risk. The factors and merchants in India wanted autonomy and the freedom to pursue opportunities as they perceived them. Between these desires lay constant negotiation, the slow back and forth of letters and reports that stretched across the years like a conversation conducted in a vast echo chamber. The shareholders, meanwhile, waited. They attended meetings where they were presented with accounts of distant operations. They heard reports of new factories established, trading rights secured, and returns on investment calculated. Some grew wealthy from their holdings, others found their investments disappointing. A few became wealthy enough that their shareholding in the East India Company, once their primary hope for fortune, became merely one element among many diverse investments. The company began to attract not only merchants seeking to enter commerce, but also established gentlemen looking to diversify their holdings and perhaps gain access to the exotic goods that passed through the company's warehouses. By the early decades of the 17th century, something remarkable had emerged in London, a genuinely transferable share. You could buy shares in the East India Company from other shareholders, not merely directly from the company itself. A secondary market had developed, and in this marketplace, the value of shares fluctuated based on news from Asia, market conditions, and the perceived competence of the court of directors. This was, in essence, the birth of the stock market, though it would take centuries for such markets to become commonplace. What did this structure mean for the company's actual effectiveness in pursuing its mission? That is perhaps the most subtle question we might ask. On one hand, the bureaucratic machinery ensured continuity and prevented the enterprise from depending on the whims of any single individual. A factor might die of fever in Madras, but the company persisted. An entire season's trading might prove disappointing, but the enterprise endured. On the other hand, the very complexity of the system sometimes prevented swift action, clear accountability, and genuine innovation. It was both strength and weakness, much like any human institution perhaps, yet operating at a scale and across distances never before attempted. The shareholders and directors who assembled in London's financial district in those early years could not have imagined the scale to which their creation would eventually grow. They could not have foreseen that the bureaucratic machinery they were constructing would, within 2 centuries, become the instrument of imperial conquest and rule across an entire subcontinent. They were simply businessmen trying to solve the practical problems posed by commerce at great distance. Yet in solving those problems, they had invented something new under the sun, a form of human organization that would persist far beyond the East India Company itself, would evolve and adapt, and would eventually transform the world in ways both remarkable and terrible. But the company's early success in the Spice Islands and its slow establishment along India's coasts did not go unnoticed across the waters of Europe, and nowhere more keenly than in Amsterdam, where another maritime power had begun to calculate the same arithmetic of profit and geography. The Dutch, themselves newly independent from Spanish rule and burning with the energy of a young republic, had looked eastward with the same hunger that had driven English merchants to their charters and their risks. In 1602, just 2 years after the English East India Company received its royal seal, the Dutch chartered their own company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, a creature born almost in mimicry, yet destined to become the more formidable rival that history would remember. Where the English had entered the spice trade as supplicants and newcomers, the Dutch arrived with greater capital, more disciplined military organization, and a determination forged in the furnace of their own struggle for independence. They did not come merely to trade, as the English still imagined themselves traders might, but to dominate. The Dutch company grew with extraordinary speed, its fleet expanding each year, its reach extending not just across the archipelago, but into the very waters and islands that the English had begun to cultivate. For a time, the two companies coexisted in a state of uneasy competition, each operating in different spheres, each gathering what wealth they could from cloves and nutmeg and the patient accumulation of spice shipments. But as both companies pressed deeper into the same islands, as they built warehouses on the same coasts, and competed for the favor of the same local rulers, the rivalry hardened into something far more dangerous. The tension between them was not merely economic, though that was substantial enough. It was territorial, ideological, and intensely personal. The Dutch company operated under a model that was more militarized, more unforgiving, and perhaps more ruthlessly efficient than the English approach. Where the English sought to negotiate and establish trading posts through persuasion and careful diplomacy, the Dutch increasingly relied on military force to secure their monopolies. They fortified their positions with a kind of single-minded intensity, building forts and stationing soldiers, converting what had begun as commercial outposts into something resembling territorial conquest. The English, by contrast, still operated somewhat in the older mercantile tradition, believing that trade could flourish through mutual benefit and reasonable agreement. This fundamental difference in approach would soon lead to one of the most infamous episodes in the early history of European competition in Asia, an event that would poison relations between the two companies for generations and would reverberate through the memory of both nations. It happened in 1620, on the island of Amboina, in what is now Indonesia, a place where both companies had established presence and where spices grew abundantly enough to sustain the dreams of both. The details of what occurred there have been disputed ever since, colored by partisanship and national pride, yet the outline is reasonably clear. Tensions between the English and Dutch garrisons had been building for some time, disputes over territory, over trading rights, over the proper boundaries of each company's sphere of influence. And then, whether through genuine conspiracy or through misunderstanding that spiraled into paranoia, the Dutch became convinced that the English were plotting against them, attempting to seize control of the island and its treasures. The Dutch governor, feeling threatened, acting with the harsh certainty of a military commander, ordered the arrest of the English traders and soldiers present on the island. What followed was a series of interrogations, many of which involved torture, an application of pain designed to extract confessions of conspiracy that may or may not have existed. 10 English and Japanese men were eventually executed, hanged on charges of treason and conspiracy. The English survivors who made their way back home brought with them not only trauma and rage, but also a narrative that would be rehearsed and re-rehearsed in London for decades to come, a story of Dutch brutality and treachery that made any genuine accommodation between the two companies nearly impossible. It became known as the Amboina Massacre, though whether it merited that grave title Whether the Dutch actions were calculated cruelty or panicked overreaction remains a question that historians still turn over in their minds. What is certain is that Amboina changed something fundamental in the relationship between English and Dutch power in Asia. The English, shocked and wounded, withdrew from the Spice Islands almost entirely. The dream of monopolizing cloves and nutmeg faded, and in its place, a new strategy began to form in the minds of English merchants and company directors. If the Dutch were to dominate the archipelago, if the most valuable spices would remain beyond English reach, then perhaps England's fortune lay elsewhere. Perhaps India itself, vast and complex and still relatively open, offered better prospects. Perhaps the answer to Dutch dominance in the east was not to compete in the same waters, but to turn southward and westward, to establish themselves more firmly on the Indian subcontinent itself, where the Mughal Empire still held sway, and where the promise of cotton, indigo, and eventually other riches might sustain an empire as surely as spices could. This shift was not instantaneous, nor was it a conscious strategic pivot announced in any board meeting. Rather, it emerged gradually from the wreckage of Amboina, from the recognition that the company's strength might lie not in the spice trade where the Dutch held such superior force, but in the vast interior of India and in the trade networks that connected the subcontinent to the world. The company's agents, those men who had established the early factories at Surat and who were slowly extending their reach along the coasts, began to receive more resources, more attention, more backing from London. The focus of company energy began to shift, almost like a great ship slowly changing course, away from the eastern islands and toward the greater subcontinent to the west. Yet even as this reorientation was occurring, the Dutch threat remained real and present. The Dutch company continued to grow in power and reach, and in the decades that followed Amboina, it established a kind of undisputed supremacy throughout the East Indies. They controlled the spice trade so completely that they could restrict supplies to maintain prices, a form of monopolistic power that enriched the company beyond measure, but that would eventually provoke criticism and resistance from other European powers. The English, meanwhile, settled into their Indian strategy with increasing commitment. They would not be the masters of the Spice Islands, but they might, just might, become the dominant foreign power in India itself. It was a consolation prize, perhaps, born from failure and rivalry, yet it would prove to be the greater prize after all, the one that would eventually transform the company from a merchant enterprise into something that resembled an empire. The balance of power in Asia would not remain static, and neither would the English company, which had learned from its collision with the Dutch that survival itself required adaptation and a willingness to chase fortune into new territories and new forms of power altogether. There came a point, somewhere between the monsoon seasons of the 1680s and the turn of the 18th century, when the East India Company's imagination began to shift. It was not a sudden thing, not a moment of deliberate choice announced in the boardroom back in London, but rather a slow, almost organic turning, like a ship gradually changing course without anyone quite noticing the helm had moved. The merchants who had arrived on the coasts of India and Southeast Asia came with ledgers and trade goods, with the intention of buying low and selling high, of extracting profit from the established networks of silk, cotton, spices, and indigo that had flowed through these regions for centuries. But as they sat in their factories, watching the political landscape around them, something deeper began to take hold. They began to see that perhaps wealth was not merely something to be exchanged, but something to be extracted from land itself, from tax collection, from the labor and resources of entire territories. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The company had initially acquired its settlements through negotiation, through the granting of trade privileges by local rulers who saw little threat in foreign merchants confined to their warehouses and ships. Bombay had come through marriage, as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza to King Charles II in 1661. A curious thing, a Portuguese bride bringing with her an island that would eventually become one of the jewels of company territory. Madras and Calcutta had been established through careful diplomacy, through requests to build modest fortifications, structures that were ostensibly meant only to protect goods from pirates and rival European traders. But as the 17th century drew toward its close, those modest fortifications began to grow. Walls rose higher, cannons were mounted on bastions. Soldiers who had once been primarily concerned with guarding warehouses now began to drill in formations, to prepare for conflicts that went beyond the usual commercial disputes. What was happening, in many ways, was inevitable. As the company's wealth and presence grew, it naturally attracted rivals. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had established itself as a formidable force in the archipelago, controlling the most profitable spice routes with ruthless efficiency. The French were emerging as competitors as well, establishing their own outposts and seeking to build their own commercial networks. In this environment of cutthroat European competition, the company's settlement could not remain purely commercial enterprises. They had to become fortified strongholds. The company's executives in London, and more particularly the governors and factors in India itself, began to understand that their trading posts would only survive if they could defend themselves, not just against pirates and bandits, but against rival European powers who might seek to seize them by force. Consider what was required to establish and maintain a true fortification in a tropical climate. Thousands of miles from home, walls had to be built of substantial stone or brick, structures that could withstand cannon fire. Bastions had to be angled to allow defenders to cover all approaches. Ditches, sometimes filled with water, had to be dug and maintained. Guns had to be hauled across the seas at great expense, mounted on carriages, supplied with ammunition and powder. Soldiers had to be recruited, trained, paid, clothed and fed. Magazines had to be built to store grain and provisions. All of this required not just capital, but an entirely new way of thinking about what a trading company was and what it might become. It required the company to become, in essence, a military organization that happened to trade, or perhaps it is more accurate to say, it became a trading organization that happened to wage war. The coastal settlements took on new characters as these transformations occurred. Bombay, spreading across its islands with walls and batteries, began to resemble a European fortress as much as an Eastern trading post. Fort William in Calcutta, begun in 1690, rose with its brick bastions and palisaded perimeter, dominating the riverbank like an assertion of European order imposed upon the landscape of Bengal. Madras, with its Fort St. George, acquired the formal geometry of European military architecture, all straight lines and calculated angles designed to channel invaders into killing zones. These were not merely larger versions of the early trading factories, but something categorically different. They were assertions of territorial control, statements made in stone and metal that the company intended not merely to trade here, but to rule here. The fortification process also required a shift in the company's relationship with the Indian populations around these settlements. Local rulers had initially permitted the building of modest structures, viewing them as harmless to their authority. But when those modest structures began to transform into imposing fortresses, bristling with artillery, questions arose. Why did merchants need such defenses? Whose authority did these walls represent? Were they directed inward against local populations or outward against European rivals? The answer, increasingly, was both. The company did indeed fear European competitors, but it also began to recognize that possession of force might allow it to reshape its commercial relationships with the surrounding regions. Shall we imagine what it felt like to stand within one of these early fortifications on a humid afternoon, perhaps around 1700, when the transformation was well underway but still relatively recent. The air would have been thick, almost tangible, the smell of lime mortar, fresh-cut wood, and salt water mixed with the scents of the tropical garden beyond the walls. Soldiers would move through their routines, polishing brass, checking the wheels on gun carriages, their uniforms damp with perspiration, the sound of anvils ringing from the blacksmith shop, the creak of wooden gates, the distant chanting of workers mending the ramparts. Inside the walls, a small, carefully ordered world, the governor's residence with its neat columns and shuttered windows, the warehouses stacked with goods, the barracks where soldiers rested, the marketplace where local traders came to sell provisions to the garrison. It was a piece of Europe grafted onto India, maintained with constant effort against the climate and the surrounding landscape. What drove this transformation from trading post to fortress? There is no single answer, though we might identify several converging forces. There was, certainly, the competitive pressure from rival European companies, each seeking dominance over the same routes and territories. There was the growing recognition that violence, or the threat of violence, was sometimes more profitable than pure trade. There was the influence of military men who saw in the company the potential for something grander than commerce. And there was perhaps something deeper still, something about the European mind of this era, a tendency to imagine that territory could be owned in ways that were absolute, exclusive, and could be defended and expanded through force. In Europe itself, the 17th and 18th centuries were witnessing the rise of the modern nation-state, the consolidation of power through standing armies and clearly delineated borders. The East India Company, in a way, was simply importing this model to Asia, translating the vocabulary of European territorial sovereignty into the coastal regions of India and beyond. But there is something poignant, too, in this transformation, something that might invite a moment of gentle reflection. The company had begun, at least in the minds of its founders, as something almost innocent, a commercial venture, a joint stock enterprise meant to bring profitable trade to English merchants. By the early 1700s, it was becoming something far more complex, far more dangerous, far more intertwined with power and sovereignty. The cannons mounted on the bastions were not merely defensive measures, they were also tools of expansion. Each fortress created a permanent foothold, a territorial claim that went beyond mere commercial privilege. Each fortified settlement became a base from which further expansion might occur. The company's merchants and factors, sitting in their offices writing reports to London, probably did not see themselves as conquerors. They saw themselves as businessmen, protecting their interests against rivals, establishing security for their operations. Yet the stones and bricks and cannon barrels they were assembling were the raw materials from which empire would be built. The transformation from trader to territorial power was not a sudden change of policy, but rather an accumulation of pragmatic decisions, each one seemingly reasonable, that together added up to something genuinely revolutionary. As the 17th century drew toward its close and the 18th century began to emerge from the mists of time, something was quietly shifting in the vast subcontinent that the company had, until now, treated largely as a place of commerce and negotiation. The Mughal Empire, which had stood for nearly 2 centuries as a unified and formidable power stretching across the Indian landscape, was not collapsing in any dramatic sense. There were no thunderous wars, no sudden catastrophic defeats that one might read about in the chronicles of earlier empires. Instead, what was happening was far more subtle, more like watching a great tapestry slowly unravel thread by thread, not all at once, but in a way that became increasingly visible only to those who were paying careful attention. The Emperor Aurangzeb, who had reigned for nearly half a century and had held the sprawling Mughal domains together through force of will and military campaigns, had died in 1707. In his wake, the machinery of imperial authority began, almost imperceptibly, to lose its grip on the vast territories that had once bowed to a single throne. His successors lacked either his ambition or his ruthlessness, and the regional governors, the Nawabs and Subadars who ruled in the emperor's name in distant provinces, began to sense that the hand from Delhi was no longer quite as firm, no longer quite as quick to punish dissent or to reward obedience. Picture, if you will, the slow loosening of a knot. The threads of central authority, which had bound the empire together, were not severed all at once. Rather, they began to fray, and as they did, those local rulers who governed their provinces with a degree of autonomy they had previously only dreamed of began to wonder, why should they continue to send their tributes to an emperor whose power seemed to be waning? Why should they defer to a court in Delhi when they might consolidate power in their own domains? It was a question that, once asked, could not be unasked. The company's merchants and factors and agents, the men who spent their days in the shadowed depths of warehouses and the sweltering heat of counting rooms, began to notice this shift. They were observers by nature, these traders. They had to be. They had learned to read the currents of politics and commerce as closely as a sailor reads the sky, for their livelihoods depended upon understanding the subtle signs of power and advantage. And what they began to perceive, in the closing years of the 17th century and the opening years of the 18th, was an extraordinary opportunity. In Bengal, where the company had established itself in Calcutta, the Nawab's authority, while still real and still commanding respect, was beginning to seem less absolute. In the Deccan, far to the south, other Nawabs were carving out their own small empires, and the ties that bound them to the Mughal throne were becoming gossamer thin. In Madras and along the Coromandel coast, the company's agents found themselves navigating a landscape of power that was far more fragmented than it had been in earlier decades. Where once there had been a unified imperial authority that granted firmans and established clear rules of trade, there was now a kind of ambiguity, a space where different powers vied for influence and authority, and where a clever trader, backed by resources and armed men, might find his voice suddenly granted greater weight. What is it, one might wonder, that allows a merchant company to transform itself into a political power? It is perhaps this, the existence of a vacuum, a space where legitimate authority has weakened, and the presence of resources, discipline, and will to fill that space. The company had the resources. It had built up capital through decades of profitable trade. It had developed the discipline of military organization, and increasingly, as the 18th century advanced, it began to cultivate the will. The British merchants in India were not unique in this regard. The Dutch, the French, the Portuguese all operated in a similar environment, and all of them sensed the shifting ground beneath their feet. But what the British would eventually discover was that they possessed something their rivals did not, or at least not to the same degree. They possessed a remarkable capacity for organization, a willingness to adapt their structures to new circumstances, and perhaps most importantly, an ability to find in local circumstances the justification for expansion. A regional conflict here, a rival power's aggression there, a threat to their trading post, a request for protection from a local ruler who had begun to feel the instability of his own position. These were the small incremental steps by which a trading company would, over the course of decades, gradually transform itself into an empire. The narrative that would eventually bind all of this together had not yet been written. No company official, sitting in a London office in the year 1710 or 1715, could have foreseen the shape that events would take. They were merely responding to circumstances as they presented themselves, making decisions based on immediate concerns, immediate profits, immediate security. And yet, those decisions, made one upon another, gradually created a momentum that the company itself could barely control. It was like a heavy ship that, once given the slightest push in one direction, requires an enormous force to change its course. In the Deccan, The great Mughal administrator Asaf Jah I, known as the Nizam, had established what was becoming an increasingly independent kingdom in Hyderabad. In Bengal, the Nawabs were discovering that the tax revenues collected in their name could be more profitably deployed in building their own power bases than in remitting them to Delhi. In the south, among the successor states of the great Hindu empires that had once dominated the region, new powers were rising, and these powers saw the European trading companies not as foreign interlopers but as potential allies in local struggles for supremacy. The very fragmentation of authority, the very dissolution of the unified Mughal order, was creating the conditions in which a well-resourced foreign company, operating from secure fortified bases, could gradually accumulate influence and power. The company's agents did not consciously plot this transformation. There was no grand conspiracy, no meeting in London where ambitious directors decided that they would overthrow the Mughal order and establish British rule across India. What happened was far more organic, far more gradual. A company official would extend credit to a local ruler in exchange for trading privileges. A threat would emerge from a rival power, and the company would offer military protection in exchange for territorial concessions or revenue rights. A local governor, feeling the instability of his position, would seek alliance with a power he perceived as strong and stable. One small transaction led to another, and the cumulative effect was the slow, almost unconscious transformation of the company's role in India from that of merchant to that of power broker, and eventually, though it would take a few more decades and one crucial battle to make this explicit, to that of conqueror and sovereign. In the quiet counting rooms of the company's factories, in the candle-lit chambers where the court of directors in London made decisions that would reverberate across an entire continent, in the minds of ambitious young company servants who saw in the changing political landscape an opportunity for advancement and wealth, the seeds of a new order were being sown, but they did not yet know it. They were simply responding to the opportunities that presented themselves in a world where the old certainties were crumbling away. In the middle years of the 18th century, there arrived in India a man whose name would become inseparable from the moment the East India Company transformed from merchants into sovereigns, and his story begins not with grand military ambition, but with the quiet desperation of a young clerk who had lost nearly everything. Robert Clive was born in 1725 to a modest English family, and at 17, with few prospects and a disposition that unsettled his elders, he was sent to Madras as a humble writer, a clerk whose job was to record transactions and maintain ledgers in the humid warehouses of the company's coastal settlement. For a young man of restless temperament, the work was suffocating, and within months of his arrival in 1744, he attempted suicide, the precise details now lost to history, but the outcome was that he survived, and in surviving, something shifted in him. He emerged from that darkness possessed of an almost reckless determination, as if he had already faced the worst and found himself still standing. The company itself, by this time, was facing a crisis that mere ledgers could not resolve. For more than a century, it had been a trader, buying and selling, negotiating with local rulers, maintaining its factories through careful diplomacy and the strategic placement of its wealth. But the world around it was convulsing. The Mughal Empire, that vast and once magnificent structure, was fragmenting. The death of the great Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707 had released ancient tensions and ambitions held dormant by his iron rule, and now every regional power, every ambitious Nawab and territorial prince, was reaching for greater dominion. At the same time, the French East India Company, energized by the resources and strategic vision of their Governor-General, was not content to remain merely a trader either. They were fortifying their coastal settlements, raising small armies, and beginning to offer their military services to local Indian rulers as a way to secure territory and influence. It became clear to the company's leadership that in this shifting world, a merchant could no longer survive without becoming, in some measure, a soldier. Clive, with his mixture of ambition and that peculiar fearlessness that near death sometimes bestows, proved to be precisely the man for this turning point. He was commissioned as an ensign in the company's military service, and when war broke out between the British and French over control of the Carnatic region, he found his calling. He fought in several skirmishes, demonstrated a gift for tactics, and an almost intuitive understanding of how small numbers of disciplined soldiers could defeat larger forces of less organized troops, and gradually earned the respect of both his superiors and, more importantly, the Indian rulers whose favor was now becoming the real currency of power in southern India. After years of minor conflicts and careful maneuvers, Clive returned to England a colonel and a minor celebrity, the man who had helped secure British supremacy in the Carnatic. He was also wealthy, which in Georgian England opened doors that had been firmly closed to him as a youth. But India had not released him from its grip. By 1756, the situation in Bengal, the richest province of India, was deteriorating rapidly. The young Nawab Siraj ud-Daulah, whose rule had become erratic and whose tolerance for the European trading posts was evaporating, had arrested several company employees and thrown them into what became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, a small, airless dungeon where most perished during a single night of suffocation and terror. The outrage that rippled through company circles and back to London was profound, and more importantly for the company's purposes, it provided justification for what was already being contemplated: the use of military force not to defend territory, but to seize it. Clive was dispatched back to India with explicit instructions and an army of nearly 2,000 men, soldiers, sepoys and artillery crews, and he arrived in Bengal in 1757 with the authority to do whatever he deemed necessary to restore company interests. The young Nawab Siraj ud-Daulah had assembled an army of perhaps 50,000 men to confront the British threat, and on the surface, the numbers seemed to render the outcome inevitable. But numbers, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, tell only part of the story. On the 16th of June in 1757, the two forces met near a village called Plassey, and what unfolded in those humid hours was less a great battle than a carefully orchestrated political maneuver masked as military victory. Clive, through his intelligence network, had learned that the Nawab's principal general, Mir Jafar, harbored doubts about the young ruler and might be persuaded to switch his allegiance if victory seemed assured. And so Clive, in a moment of audacious calculation, placed his smaller force in such a position that it appeared vulnerable, and when the Nawab's army attacked in the early morning, the British artillery, more accurate and faster than anything the Indian forces possessed, inflicted devastating casualties. Sepoys in the Nawab's army began to waver. Mir Jafar's own troops, whether by pre-arrangement or opportunistic timing, seemed reluctant to engage fully. Within hours, the Nawab's forces collapsed, and Siraj ud-Daulah fled, leaving his throne exposed. What is often overlooked in the accounts of Plassey is that this was not the triumph of superior European military technology, though that played a role, nor was it the inevitable victory of civilizational superiority, a narrative that would be written and rewritten in the years to come. Rather, it was the successful exploitation of internal Indian political divisions, the leveraging of factional rivalries that already existed, and the willingness of a sophisticated military leader to use every tool at his disposal, including those that blurred the line between negotiation and deception. Clive, in essence, transformed what might have been a destructive civil conflict into a swift transfer of power that left the company in control of the wealthiest territory in India. It was, in its way, brilliant and ruthless in equal measure, and it worked. The significance of what happened in those few hours near that small village cannot be overstated. Before Plassey, the East India Company had been a merchant corporation with territory only in the sense that empires granted it the right to trade and the security of small fortified settlements. After Plassey, it became something fundamentally different: a territorial power, a ruling authority, a collector of taxes from millions of subjects. The company installed Mir Jafar as the puppet Nawab, a man whose authority would be hollow and whose every significant decision would be made in consultation with company officials. Revenue from Bengal, once the wealth of the province had flowed to the Mughal emperor and his appointed governors, now flowed directly into company coffers and thereby to its shareholders in England. And this transformation happened so quietly, so swiftly, that there was scarcely time for anyone to recognize that they had witnessed the precise moment when a commercial enterprise became an empire. Clive himself, standing in the aftermath of his victory, understood what had transpired, even if the full implications would take decades to fully mature. He had proven that the company's future lay not in accommodation with Indian rulers, but in their subordination, not in trade on terms set by local authorities, but in the extraction of wealth from territories the company now controlled directly. In the years that followed, he would consolidate his power in Bengal, suppress rival factions both within and outside the company, and lay the groundwork for the territorial expansion that would eventually place nearly the entire subcontinent under company dominion. He would also become extraordinarily wealthy, his personal fortune swollen by the rewards of victory, by gifts from grateful company directors, and by means that were far less scrupulous, including the manipulation of trade monopolies and the acceptance of bribes from Indian merchants desperate to maintain their own economic survival. Yet success, particularly when achieved through the suppression of others, carries with it a certain psychological weight. In his later years, after his retirement and return to England, Clive would suffer from periods of profound depression, from the kind of melancholy that no amount of wealth or honours could entirely dispel. He would become embroiled in controversies over his conduct in India, facing parliamentary inquiries and public accusations of corruption, and these investigations seemed to wound him deeply, as if some part of his conscience recognized that what had been achieved at Plassey had come at a cost that extended far beyond the battlefield. But that is a reflection for another moment in this journey. What matters as this section closes is this: Robert Clive, through a single day of fighting and a network of political agreements, fundamentally altered the trajectory of world history. The East India Company's pivot from commerce to conquest, a pivot that would reshape India, enrich Britain beyond imagination, and set the stage for the imperial structures that would dominate the globe for the next 2 centuries, crystallized in that moment. Everything that came after, the famines, the extraction of wealth on an unprecedented scale, the erosion of Indian manufacturing and agriculture, the birth of modern imperialism itself, all of it can be traced back to the quiet fatality of Plassey, to the moment when a merchant's company decided to become a conqueror's instrument. The dust had barely settled on the field of Plassey when Robert Clive understood something that most men in London would take years to grasp. The battle itself, a day of manoeuvring and artillery fire in June of 1757, had been tactically modest, almost anticlimactic in its resolution. But what followed from that modest victory was something far more consequential than any military triumph. It was a slow, almost imperceptible transformation of the East India Company, from a merchant enterprise into something it had never quite been before: a government. A corporation that would now collect taxes, administer justice, maintain armies not as a trader's protection, but as an occupying power. The shift happened quietly, almost without ceremony, in documents and letters and ledgers that moved across the Bay of Bengal and then to London, where they accumulated in offices and boardrooms with the inevitability of sediment building on an ocean floor. Within months of his victory at Plassey, Clive had negotiated what would become the legal and moral foundation of company rule over Bengal. The Nawab of Bengal, the young, malleable Mir Jafar, installed now as a company puppet in place of the independent Siraj ud-Daulah, had granted to the East India Company the Diwani. To modern ears, the word carries little weight. It sounds almost musical, abstract, the kind of term one might encounter in poetry. But the Diwani was the right to collect revenue, to administer taxes, to become in essence the financial authority of a vast region. Bengal in the late 18th century was one of India's richest provinces, fertile with rice and indigo and cotton, populated by millions, generating revenues that had for centuries flowed into the treasuries of Muslim and Hindu rulers. Now those revenues would flow instead into company coffers. The transformation was, in a quiet way, total. What made this moment so unusual in the history of European commerce was its absolute brazenness, and yet its utter legality, at least as the company understood legality. The Dutch had fortified their settlements in the Indies. The Portuguese had established their outposts along the coast. But neither had attempted what the company was now doing, the wholesale assumption of fiscal and administrative authority over a vast terrestrial empire. They had remained, in essence, traders. The company was becoming something else, something without clear precedent in the European world. It was a corporation collecting taxes. It was a merchant company issuing decrees. It was private enterprise becoming public government without ever formally ceasing to be private. The Diwani grant gave the company the right to collect the land tax, the revenue that sustained India's ancient systems of irrigation, public works, and administration. In theory, the company would maintain these systems, would continue to function as a landlord's agent in the vast machinery of agrarian life. In practice, something more destructive was beginning to happen. The company was now extracting wealth not for reinvestment in the region, but for remittance to London, for dividends to shareholders, for the enrichment of a distant metropolis that had no stake in Bengal's long-term prosperity. The old Mughal system, for all its faults and corruptions, had at least remained invested in the territories it ruled. The new system was something different. It was a parasitic relationship dressed in the language of commerce and legality. The administrative structure that the company erected in Bengal was, in many ways, a marvel of bureaucratic organization. Clive established a governor-general, himself, in the first instance, with subordinate officials in each district, each responsible for revenue collection, for the administration of justice, for the maintenance of order. They hired Indian clerks, accountants, tax collectors, men who understood the local systems of agriculture and revenue, who spoke the languages and knew the customs. The company created a hybrid administration, European at the top, Indian throughout the middle and lower ranks, with communication flowing through both formal channels and networks of family connection and obligation that the company men hardly understood. It was efficient in its way. It was also fundamentally extractive. The daily work of company officials during these early years of territorial administration was in many cases morally ambiguous in ways that pure commerce had not been. A trader buying indigo or cotton could maintain a certain distance from the systems that produced those goods. But a man appointed as a company official to collect taxes in a Bengali district was now directly involved in the machinery of extraction. He set the tax rates, or interpreted the rates set above him. He decided which lands would be held liable for payment, and which might be forgiven. He stood, in effect, in the place where power and wealth met, where the delicate balance of rural life could be tipped toward prosperity or toward hardship, with a stroke of a pen or a decision made in the corner of an office. What is perhaps most striking about the company's assumption of the Diwani is how quickly the executives in Calcutta began to behave not like merchants but like despots. Having won the right to collect revenue, they began to increase it. The land tax, which had been a substantial but sustainable levy under earlier administrations, was raised repeatedly. Fields that had been fertile for centuries became subject to demands that exceeded their productive capacity. Zamindars, the middlemen landowners who collected revenue from peasants, found themselves squeezed between the company's demands and their subjects' ability to pay. The system that had sustained millions began, almost imperceptibly at first, to consume itself. The company's transformation from trader to territorial authority happened so gradually that the company men themselves may not have fully recognized what they were becoming. They spoke the language of commerce. They counted everything in profit and loss. They believed, or at least convinced themselves, that they were bringing order and efficiency to a region they viewed as chaotic and corrupt. They were, in this telling, improvers, modernizers. The fact that their modernization served primarily to extract wealth, that their efficiency was measured in the volume of resources they could pump out of Bengal and into the company's accounts, this fact was either invisible to them or simply beside the point. The hunger for profit had found a new form, not the small transactions of merchant capitalism, but the vast, systematic extraction of wealth that came from controlling the fiscal system of an entire region. By the 1760s, barely a decade after Plassey, the company had become something that would have been unimaginable to those London merchants who had gathered to sign its charter in 1600. It ruled millions of people. It collected taxes on vast territories. It administered justice, maintained order, and wielded the power of life and death through its soldiers and officials. It did all of this not as a government, though it functioned entirely as one, but as a corporation, as an entity whose primary obligation was to its shareholders, whose ultimate purpose was the generation of profit. The company had not abolished the forms of the old administration. It had simply redirected them, channeled them toward new ends, and in doing so, it had become something genuinely new in the world. An empire operated as a business venture, a nation ruled by directors who answered not to the ruled, but to investors. Yet the transformation of the company from merchant to sovereign came not without profound consequence, and in the decades that followed Plassey, the machinery of commerce grinding forward in Bengal began to remake the very substance of life itself for millions who had never heard the East India Company's name spoken aloud. The shift was not sudden, nothing about power's accumulation ever is, but rather a slow tightening of the threads by which wealth flowed from the countryside into company warehouses, and from there onto English ships bound for London, where distant shareholders reaped the rewards of extraction. When the company assumed the Diwani, the right to collect taxes, its agents faced a peculiar challenge. They had inherited not a nation's treasury, but a people's agricultural system, one that had been refined across centuries to sustain both farmer and crown through seasons of plenty and seasons of scarcity. The Mughal emperors who came before had understood, even if imperfectly, that a kingdom was only as strong as the food that fed its people. But the company's directors in Calcutta faced a different accounting. The shareholders in London waited for returns. The dividends were expected. The investments required justification. And so the company's officials, many of them young men who had arrived in India with ledgers and ambition, but without the deep knowledge of monsoon cycles and soil fertility that such a position demanded, began to raise the land revenue, the taxes collected from the peasantry who worked the soil. Year after year, the assessments climbed. What the Mughals had collected with some regard for local capacity, the company often collected with a regard only for the ledger's bottom line. There was no conspiracy here, no gathering in candle-lit rooms to plot suffering. It was something quieter and more terrible, the logic of extraction applied to a landscape and people that could not absorb it without breaking. The consequences unfolded slowly at first, almost invisibly in the accounting books. Then, beginning in the 1760s, as years of drought followed one upon another like a relentless tide, the full weight of this new system revealed itself. The earth itself seemed to turn stubborn. Monsoons failed, wells ran dry. farmers found themselves unable to meet the company's demands while also feeding their own families. They began to borrow, and in their borrowing, we might pause to reflect on how debt becomes another form of bondage, taking loans at punishing rates from moneylenders, only to find that the next failed harvest made repayment impossible. Some sold their tools, others sold their land, and when there was nothing left to sell, they began to die. The Bengal famine of 1770 remains one of history's quietest catastrophes, if such a thing can be said of mass death. Perhaps 10 million people perished. The exact number is lost to time and poor record-keeping, which is itself a kind of erasure. Contemporaries who witnessed it described a landscape of haunting quiet, villages emptied, roads lined with bodies, an absence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. Yet in the company's records, in the neat columns of revenue collected and profit accounted for, there is sometimes barely a note of what had occurred. The machines of bureaucracy did not pause. The ships continued to arrive and depart. What makes this interval particularly worth contemplating as we move through this history in the dark is the gap between intention and consequence. The company's officials were not, for the most part, cruel men delighting in suffering. Many of them believed themselves to be engaged in a rational enterprise. They were implementing what they understood as modern, efficient systems. They were improving the territory they governed, building roads and establishing order. These things were, in their own way, true, and yet the systems they implemented, when applied without the flexibility that experience and empathy might have counseled, functioned as an engine of destitution. There were voices raised in protest, even then. Some company officials stationed in Bengal, having witnessed the famine's aftermath, wrote dispatches expressing alarm at the trajectory of policy. The Warren Hastings, who became Governor-General in 1772 and served for 13 years, was by many accounts a thoughtful administrator who eventually moved to moderate the worst of the revenue exactions. He recognized, as others came slowly to recognize, that a territory could not be profitable if it was dead, that the peasantry had to have enough to survive, and ideally to flourish a little, or the entire apparatus would collapse. And so some adjustments were made. But the damage was already woven into the fabric of Bengal. The famine had broken something, not only in the people who survived it, but in the ecological and social systems that had once bound community together. The networks of obligation and reciprocity that had once sustained villages through difficult times had been strained to breaking. The patterns of cultivation and conservation had been disrupted, and the company, despite its slowly improving policies in subsequent years, remained an institution oriented toward extraction rather than regeneration. It drew wealth outward, toward England. This was, after all, its fundamental purpose. What emerges when we sit quietly with this history is perhaps the recognition that empires are not typically built through obvious wickedness. They are built through the steady application of institutional logic, through systems that are rational within their own terms, and yet whose consequences, when aggregated across millions of people and years of time, take on a weight of suffering that no single decision or person intended. The company was not monolithic. Within it were people of conscience, of intelligence, capable of doubt and adjustment. Yet the structure itself, the hunger it embodied for growth and return, for the conversion of living landscapes into numbers in an accounting book, this hunger was built into the company's bones. And so the Bengal famine stands as a threshold in this history, a moment where the company's transformation from trading venture into territorial empire revealed its cost. The profits continued. The ships brought wealth back to England. The shareholders received their returns. But beneath the surface, in villages across Bengal, something had changed irreversibly. A population that had numbered perhaps 30 million at the beginning of company rule would grow barely at all for decades afterward. The demographic record itself becomes an archive of loss. By the middle of the 18th century, Something quietly extraordinary had begun to take shape across the Indian subcontinent. The East India Company, which had started as a merchant venture with trading posts and warehouses, had assembled something that rivaled the standing armies of European nations themselves. And this was not incidental to its purpose. This was deliberate. This was essential. The company had become, in essence, a military as well as a commercial enterprise, and somewhere in the accounting ledgers and the regimental rolls, the distinction between soldier and shareholder had begun to blur in ways that would reshape the future of continents. The numbers themselves carry a quiet weight. By the 1750s, the company employed perhaps 30,000 Indian soldiers, sepoys as they were called, trained in European military discipline and armed with European weapons. To place this in perspective, this force was comparable to the armies fielded by some of the great powers of Europe at the same moment in history. The British Army itself numbered perhaps 40,000 men across all its garrisons and theatres. Here was a private corporation commanding troops whose scale matched the ambitions of kings. Yet these soldiers served not crown and country, but shareholders and directors seated in London counting houses, men who had invested their capital in the hope of returns, men who read market reports and consulted ledgers by candlelight. The company's military forces had evolved gradually from small groups of guards protecting warehouses and merchandise. As the company's territorial claims expanded, particularly after the Battle of Plassey and the acquisition of revenue-collecting rights in Bengal, these protective forces transformed into something far more organized, far more hierarchical, far more formidable. They became an instrument of expansion, occupation, and control. The sepoys were recruited from various regions of India, often from agricultural communities, trained in discipline that would have been foreign to their experience, and integrated into a chain of command overseen by British officers drawn from military families or younger sons seeking fortune and rank in the company's service. The infrastructure required to maintain such an army was immense. Supply lines extended from ports to inland garrisons. Arsenals were established where weapons and ammunition were stored and maintained. Barrack complexes sprawled across the landscape. The logistics of feeding, clothing, arming, and training 30,000 men created an entire economy within the company's operations. In some ways, the military tail had begun to wag the commercial dog. The protection of trade routes and trading posts had required soldiers, but soldiers required resources, and resources required revenues, and revenues required territorial control and tax collection. Each step seemed to follow naturally from the one before, yet each step took the company further from commerce and closer to empire. Consider the perspective of a sepoy during this period. If we can imagine such a moment of reflection, a man recruited from a village in northern India, perhaps, drawn into military service by need or circumstance or the magnetic pull of wages and structure, he would have found himself transformed. His body would have been taught new movements, his mind new disciplines. He would wear a uniform, carry a musket, march in formation, respond to commands spoken in a foreign tongue. He would defend the interests of men he would never meet, in a cause whose ultimate purpose might have remained obscure to him. Yet he served with skill. The sepoys became known for their capability, their discipline, their effectiveness in combat. They were not simply conscripts or mercenaries, though the line between those categories and something more complex was perhaps never entirely clear. The presence of this private army raised profound, if largely unspoken questions about authority and legitimacy. By what right did a commercial corporation command armed forces? The company possessed a charter granted by the Crown, and that charter had been interpreted with increasing latitude. The charter granted the company authority to protect its property, but somewhere along the way, that protection had extended to the conquest and governance of territories. The army that had been justified as a defensive measure had become an offensive instrument. And the shareholders, those merchants and gentlemen and widows and orphans whose money had been invested in the company's ventures, were now, in effect, shareholders in an empire. Their dividends were not merely drawn from trade goods, but from taxation and territory and the labor of millions. The psychological fusion of soldier and shareholder was perhaps most visible in the character of the company's officers. These were men who held military rank, but also commercial authority. A colonel might also serve as a regional administrator, collecting taxes and dispensing justice. A captain might oversee both a regiment and a warehouse. The hierarchies of military discipline and commercial hierarchy had become intertwined. Advancement in the company's service meant advancement in both domains simultaneously. A man could accumulate both rank and wealth, both honor and profit. This fusion created a new kind of leadership class in India. Men shaped by both martial and mercantile cultures, loyal to the company as both employer and symbol of power. The costs of maintaining this military machine were substantial. The company's account books show vast expenditures for soldiers' pay, weaponry, provisions, and construction of fortifications. These costs came directly from the company's revenues, which meant they came from the wealth it extracted from India. Yet, paradoxically, the very existence of the army enabled the extraction of greater wealth. The army provided security for tax collection. It enabled the company to compel merchants to trade on favorable terms. It discouraged rival powers from challenging the company's authority. The army was simultaneously an expense and an investment, a drain on profits and the means of generating those profits. It was a feedback loop that intensified with each cycle. The moral weight of commanding an army of colonized soldiers serving colonial masters was something that troubled some observers even at the time, though the troubles remained largely private ruminations rather than public outcries. A few officers expressed unease at the contradiction inherent in the situation, that men were being trained in European military techniques and given European weapons, yet remained subordinate to European officers, with little opportunity for advancement beyond certain ranks. There was something paradoxical about the structure. The company was creating an armed force of impressive capability, yet deliberately maintaining hierarchical barriers within that force based on origin and race. Whether consciously articulated or not, this structure was designed to prevent the sepoys from becoming independent military powers, to ensure they remained tools rather than actors in their own right. The relationship between the sepoy army and the territories it occupied was also complex. In many regions, the company's military forces were the visible face of company authority. They garrisoned forts and cities. They enforced company policy. They collected taxes. They were simultaneously defenders, administrators, and instruments of coercion, and yet they also existed within Indian society in ways that created unexpected connections. Some sepoys married locally, some became embedded in the communities where they were garrisoned. The British officers often remained aloof, but the sepoys themselves were not entirely foreign to the Indian landscape. They became, over time, a new element within Indian society, neither fully of the old order nor entirely separate from it. The questions that arise from this military expansion remain, even now, somewhat unresolved. How does a merchant company acquire the legitimacy to command armies? At what point does commerce become empire? These were not questions that detained the directors in their London offices, focused as they were on quarterly returns and expanding markets. Yet they were fundamental questions about power, authority, and the transformation of institutions. The company had begun as a trading venture, a capitalist enterprise in the modern sense. It had evolved into something more, a territorial power, a military force, a governing authority. The shift had happened gradually, so incrementally that many participants perhaps did not perceive the full extent of the change even as they participated in it. And in the background of this military growth lay another quiet transformation, As the company's soldiers enabled the conquest of territory, and as territory brought revenue, and as revenue accumulated in the hands of company officers and directors, the entire structure began to generate wealth on a scale that would eventually attract the attention of the British government itself. The profits being generated in India were becoming too enormous to ignore, too significant to leave entirely in private hands. The company's private army had served to establish the company's power, but that same power would eventually draw the scrutiny and ultimately the intervention of the Crown. The very success of the company's military expansion contained within it the seeds of its own subordination to larger forces. But that is a story that unfolds more slowly, in the shadows of administrative reform and parliamentary inquiry, in the gradual assertion of state authority over corporate ambition. By the middle of the 18th century, the company had become something far stranger than a mere trading corporation. It was, in essence, a floating circulatory system pumping goods through the veins of an emerging global economy. The ships themselves, those wooden vessels with their canvas billowing in monsoon winds, had become the true arteries of this empire, carrying not merely commodities, but the very sinews that bound distant continents together in an intricate web of dependence and desire. Imagine, if you will, a single company ship departing from the docks of London or Bristol on a journey that might consume 3 years of a sailor's life. Its holds, when empty, represented infinite possibility. By the time it reached the Indian coast, those holds would begin to fill with the fruits of negotiation and extraction. From the ports of Surat and Bombay, the company gathered cotton, bales upon bales of it, the soft fibre that English mills would later transform into the cloth that draped the world. But cotton alone did not make the voyage worthwhile. The margins were too thin. The true alchemy lay in the circular nature of the trade itself, the way goods moved in concentric patterns, each leg of the journey feeding the next, with profit compounding at every exchange. From India, a laden ship might press onward, eastward, toward the coast of China. Here, the company encountered an empire as vast and as ancient as any it would face, yet one that revealed a peculiar vulnerability. The Chinese imperial court, the Qing dynasty, had little use for European goods. Fine woolens meant nothing to emperors who commanded the finest silks. Glass beads held no value in a civilization that had invented porcelain. But China possessed something the world craved with almost physical desperation: tea. The leaves from the mountains of Fujian and the Yunnan highlands, steeped in hot water, had become for the English gentry not merely a beverage, but a ritual, a marker of refinement and status. The company understood this perfectly. Here was desire that could be monetized, transformed into currency. Yet the Chinese imperial authorities, suspicious of foreign traders and protective of their manufactures, would not accept payment in English coins or goods of English origin. They demanded silver, precious metal, hard currency, the global language of value. This presented a profound problem for the company's accountants. Silver flowed out of England and Europe, and yet the returns from India and the Indies were not sufficient to purchase Chinese tea in the quantities that English ladies now demanded for their afternoon rituals. The mathematics of this trade created a peculiar tension, a gap that would persist for decades and shape the trajectory of British expansion in ways both subtle and devastating. The solution, when it emerged from the minds of company merchants, was as elegant as it was troubling. They had observed, during their years in India and their ventures into the hill country of Bengal, the cultivation of an old plant. Opium poppies grew in the warm soils of Bihar and Benares, and from their seed pods came a substance that had been traded along Asian routes for centuries. In medicine, yes, but increasingly as a consumer good, a pleasure, something people desired with an intensity that rivaled tea itself. What if, the company men wondered in their counting houses and aboard their ships, What if opium could serve as currency where silver was scarce? What if the substance that the Chinese imperial court had long regarded with alarm, that it had attempted to restrict and control, could become the invisible currency that balanced the ledger between India and China, between empire and trade? The thought crystallized gradually. It was not, at first, an explicit strategy handed down from London with moral certainty. Rather, it emerged from the commercial logic that governed the company's every decision: maximize profit, minimize risk, leverage advantage wherever advantage could be found. By the early decades of the 19th century, though the seeds were planted much earlier, in these middle years we are contemplating, the opium trade had become the keystone of the company's vast commercial architecture. Picture, if you will, the global flow of goods and currency in the mind of a company official reviewing the quarterly ledgers. Ships depart from London with English manufactures and English capital. They arrive in India, where cotton is purchased with that capital. The cotton, along with other Indian goods, indigo dyes, saltpeter, spices, fills the holds and returns eastward or southward. From the opium fields of Bengal and the Ganges valleys, the company cultivates and processes the drug, refining it into cakes and balls suitable for transport and sale. These opium chests, sealed and labelled, find their way into company ships heading toward the Chinese coast, toward the forbidden ports where foreign traders congregated in uneasy coexistence with imperial authorities. The opium is sold, quietly but persistently, to Chinese merchants and smugglers who distribute it inland. The proceeds, Indian rupees, Chinese silver, credit notes, flow back to the company's coffers in Calcutta. With this silver and credit, the company can now purchase tea from Chinese merchants, can fill its holds with the precious leaves. These ships, laden with tea, return to London, where English consumers, still unaware of the economic chains binding their afternoon ritual to the suffering of Chinese addicts and the violence of company acquisition, pay premium prices. Each voyage was, in essence, a journey through different economies, different moral frameworks, different systems of value. The ship itself became the neutral space where these incommensurable worlds touched, and yet it was never truly neutral. It was a vessel of European expansion, carrying not only goods but assumptions about property, about trade, about the proper order of global commerce. The sheer scale of this operation defies easy comprehension. The company maintained a fleet of hundreds of ships at any given moment. These were not small coastal vessels but large ocean-going merchantmen, some carrying as many as 200 men through waters that still held dangers. Storms that could destroy a year's investment in hours, pirates who understood perfectly well where wealth flowed, and diseases that killed sailors with a randomness that seemed almost deliberate. The losses were enormous, the profits were larger still. What made this system so powerful, so difficult to challenge or reform, was precisely its interconnectedness. The English weaver depended on Indian cotton. The Chinese merchant depended on Indian opium to meet the demands of an addiction that was gradually, methodically being spread through the empire. The Indian farmer, in many cases, had his crops diverted to opium production by company monopolies, creating a kind of forced specialization. The English gentry depended on Chinese tea. Each dependency fed the next, and the company stood at the nexus, understanding the geometry better than any government could. Governments made war and treaties. The company made trade routes, and trade routes, in the long, slow arc of history, often proved more durable than empires themselves. The monotony of this system was strangely soothing to those who benefited from it. The ships came and went with predictable regularity. The profits accumulated in ledgers that stretched for years. The expansion seemed almost natural, not a series of conscious choices, but rather the inevitable unfolding of commercial logic. And yet with every shipment, with every voyage that knotted the web tighter, The foundations were being laid for a system that would reshape continents, alter ecosystems, and bind together in unequal relationships peoples who had never sought such binding. In the hold of a company ship, tea and cotton and opium shared space with manifests and correspondence. Everything was accounted for, measured, valued. This was the peculiar genius of the company. It had learned to quantify the world, to reduce the incalculable to numbers and ledger entries. And in doing so, it had created a structure so vast and so complex that even those who governed it could no longer fully perceive its shape. This is the middle section, continuing naturally from the company's vast territorial power and private armies into the political pressures beginning to mount in London. As the East India Company's wealth accumulated in the latter decades of the 18th century, a curious tension began to tighten like a rope wound around the heart of British governance. The company was no longer simply a merchant enterprise reporting to a distant crown through the filter of charters and renewals. It had become something far more entangled with the machinery of Parliament itself, threading influence through corridors of power in ways that blurred the very distinction between private profit and public interest. The men who sat in the Court of Directors in London were not invisible, distant figures. Many of them moved between the counting houses of the company and the benches of Parliament with fluid ease. They held seats in the Commons. They cultivated relationships with ministers. They dined with lords who shaped foreign policy. And as the company's dividends swelled, particularly after the conquest of Bengal and the steady flow of revenues from taxed territories, the fortunes of individual company shareholders also swelled, creating a class of extraordinarily wealthy men whose financial interests were inseparable from questions of national governance. This created a peculiar problem that Parliament could not entirely ignore, though it took decades for the implications to be widely understood. How could a privately held corporation, answerable ultimately to its shareholders rather than to the nation, exercise the sovereign powers of taxation and lawmaking over millions of people on the far side of the world? When the company appointed governors and judges, collected taxes, and maintained armies larger than many European nations, who truly held the ultimate authority? Was it the shareholders gathering annually to vote on dividends? Was it the Court of Directors making strategic decisions in London? Was it Parliament, which had granted the Charter but seemed increasingly unable to oversee its terms? Or was it the Crown, which had sanctioned the arrangement but mostly remained aloof from its daily operations? The tension was not merely abstract. It manifested in concrete disputes over money, authority, and accountability. When the company's practices in India generated scandal, when accounts of corruption emerged, when reports arrived describing famines that had swept through Bengal, when evidence surfaced that company officials had accumulated personal fortunes through improper dealings, Parliament found itself confronted with a troubling reality. The institution it had once chartered as a profitable venture had grown into something that required some form of control, yet the mechanisms for that control were muddled and weak. Edmund Burke, that eloquent Irish statesman and philosopher, became one of the earliest and most forceful voices, demanding that Parliament reckon with the company's power. In his speeches and writings, Burke articulated a fear that haunted more thoughtful observers, that a private corporation had been permitted to accumulate state power without assuming the responsibilities of statecraft. A king, Burke argued, could be questioned. A parliament could be held accountable. But what of a company whose directors could hide behind corporate opacity, whose shareholders pursued profit without bearing the moral weight of governance, whose actions in distant lands remained largely invisible to the British public, whose nation bore the responsibility for those actions? The solution that Parliament attempted was, at first, cautious and incremental. Rather than abolishing the company or stripping it of its powers wholesale, Parliament opted for oversight mechanisms that proved difficult to enforce across such vast distances and through such complex financial arrangements. Charter Acts were drawn up and renewed, each one attempting to impose conditions, to demand accounting, to assert Parliament's authority without quite dismantling the profitable arrangement. But these measures resembled someone tightening the leash on a dog that had already grown enormous and largely accustomed to running as it pleased. The real tension, though, lay beneath these institutional questions. It was the tension between two visions of what the company's purpose should be, to the shareholders and the merchant class that profited directly from its operations. The company existed first and foremost to generate returns on investment, revenue from Indian territories, monopolies on valuable trade goods, the privilege of importing tea and cotton and spices at costs that domestic competition could never match. These were the purposes: governance, administration, the welfare of the territories under company rule. These were secondary considerations or necessary burdens borne by the shareholders in service of the greater goal of profit. To a growing number of MPs, political philosophers, and increasingly vocal critics in the press and the public sphere, however, the company had become something else entirely. It had ceased to be merely a trading company and had assumed the mantle of an imperial power. And if it was going to rule, if it was going to tax, if it was going to exercise sovereignty over territories and peoples, then it could not simultaneously claim the privileges of a private corporation answerable only to shareholders. It would have to become answerable to the nation. It would have to accept the kind of public scrutiny and accountability that attach to all true expressions of state power. This philosophical disagreement played out across decades in parliamentary committees, in published pamphlets, in the private correspondence of politicians who found themselves divided on the question. Some argued that the company had made Britain wealthy and powerful, that its monopolies should be protected because they enriched the nation and funded its naval supremacy. Others countered that national honor and responsibility could not be subordinated to corporate dividend. Still others occupied the middle ground, seeking some compromise in which the company retained profitable trading privileges while submitting to stricter oversight of its governing functions. What made the situation all the more delicate was that the company had learned to navigate British politics with considerable skill. Its wealthy officials and shareholders cultivated relationships with ministers, funded election campaigns, and shaped public opinion through controlled leaks of favourable information and strategic silences about uncomfortable truths. The company's corporate interests were woven so thoroughly into the fabric of British wealth and power that attacking the company felt, to some, like attacking Britain itself. And yet, the fundamental contradiction could not remain unresolved forever. A nation committed to its own internal governance by law and accountability could not indefinitely permit a private corporation to govern others without those same constraints. The question was not whether that contradiction would eventually force change, but rather how violent or gradual that change might be. The answer to that question would unfold across the remaining decades of the company's existence, shaped by financial scandals, by popular outrage, by parliamentary investigations, and ultimately by a rebellion so vast and so terrible that it would shatter the illusion that the company could rule without the company of the crown itself. Yet even at the zenith of its power, when the company's ships commanded the seas and its armies conquered kingdoms, the seeds of its unravelling had already been planted, not by rival empires or hostile princes, but by the very mechanism that had sustained it, the relentless appetite for profit, and the parliament that had begun, slowly, to question what one private entity should be allowed to become. The first tremor came not as a sudden rupture, but as a whisper in Westminster, a growing murmur among members of Parliament who had begun to wonder aloud whether a corporation answerable only to its shareholders could govern millions of human beings with the same moral restraint expected of a sovereign nation. The company, after all, had been granted its original charter as a trading venture, a commercial enterprise licensed to buy and sell goods across distant seas. Yet somewhere between those early voyages to the Spice Islands and the conquest of Bengal, it had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer merely trading, it was ruling. It was taxing, it was administering justice, it was raising armies and waging wars. And it was doing all of these things not for the crown, not in the name of Britain, but for the dividends of its shareholders. This fundamental contradiction began to trouble the consciences of reformers and politicians alike. How could Parliament justify granting to a private company the powers of a state? How could it sanction the collection of taxes from millions of Indian subjects, knowing that those revenues flowed directly into the pockets of London investors rather than into the treasury of the realm? The questions, once asked, could not easily be unasked. The first Charter Act, passed in 1773, represented the beginning of the company's slow surrender of exclusive privilege. Parliament, emboldened by the scandal of company mismanagement and the revelations of corruption that had emerged from India, demanded the right to impose greater oversight. The Act established a Governor-General, a supreme authority over all company territories in India, appointed not by the directors in London, but by Parliament itself. It was a subtle but significant shift in power. The company retained its commercial charter and its trading monopoly, but the illusion that it could govern without scrutiny had evaporated. The state, through Parliament, had reasserted its claim to ultimate authority. Yet the company fought back, as institutions do when their privileges are threatened. For several decades more, it maintained its stranglehold on the India trade, its exclusive right to import tea from China, its monopoly on commerce with the subcontinent. The Charter Acts of 1793 and 1813, however, would chip away at these defences with the relentlessness of water-wearing stone. Each renewal of the company's charter came at the cost of further concessions. The 1813 Act, in particular, represented a watershed moment. For the first time in 2 centuries, the company's trading monopoly was genuinely threatened. Parliament opened the India trade to private merchants and competing companies, ending the exclusive right that had been the source of such enormous wealth. The company was permitted to retain certain privileges, the China trade, some territorial revenues, but the old certainty, the comfortable monopoly that had enriched generations of investors, was gone. The loss of the monopoly coincided with a rising tide of public criticism in Britain itself. Newspapers and pamphleteers began to air the darker stories emerging from India, tales of exploitation, of peasants ground beneath the weight of company taxes, of corruption among company officials, of famines that had swept through company territories while grain was exported to enrich shareholders. The Bengal famine that had followed the company's conquest and its rapacious fiscal policies had left millions dead, yet the dividends had continued to flow smoothly into London. As the 19th century advanced and means of communication improved, these accounts grew harder to ignore, harder for Parliament to rationalise away. Perhaps it is worth pausing here to consider what the company's defenders might have said, and what fairness to history requires we acknowledge. The company, in its own time, believed itself to be an instrument of civilization and commerce, spreading trade and order to distant lands. Its servants, many of them, believed sincerely that they were bringing progress, and there were, indeed, infrastructure developments, institutional innovations, the establishment of law courts and administrative systems. Yet set against these achievements lies an incalculable human cost, the systematic extraction of wealth from one of the world's richest regions, the dismantling of local industries, the creation of dependencies that would persist long after the company itself had faded from history. The Charter Act of 1833 struck perhaps the most decisive blow. Parliament, now dominated by voices advocating free trade and parliamentary reform, stripped the company of its remaining commercial privileges. It was allowed to retain its administrative authority in India, but only as the agent of the crown, not as a private merchant seeking profit. The contradiction had been resolved, at last, by eliminating commerce entirely. The company was now explicitly a governing body, no longer a trading entity. The separation, however, came too late to restore either its legitimacy or its viability. The years that followed saw the company clinging to power while its authority hemorrhaged away. More charter acts, more inquiries, more revelations of misconduct. The institution that had once seemed immortal, that had conquered kingdoms and amassed fortunes, found itself reduced to the status of a caretaker administration, its directors increasingly little more than well-compensated functionaries of the crown. The shareholders watched their dividends shrink. The company's prestige, once so glittering, had tarnished. And in the subcontinent itself, the Indian people whose labor and resources had built this empire were beginning to awaken to the possibility of independence. The company's decline, gradual as it had been, now accelerated toward its inevitable conclusion. By the middle of the 1856, the machinery of the company had grown so vast, so intricate, that perhaps no single hand could any longer steady it. The factories had become fortresses, the traders had become governors, the shareholders in London lived in a state of perpetual unease, for they had built something that had escaped the quiet logic of ledgers and quarterly accounts, something that could no longer be managed by dispatch and charter alone. In May of that year, at a cantonment near Meerut, about 40 miles from Delhi, a spark ignited that would shake the entire apparatus to its foundations. It began with something almost mundane, a question of grease and faith, and the dignity of soldiers who had been asked to bite cartridges whose preparation violated the sacred rules of their own communities. The sepoys, Indian soldiers who formed the backbone of the company's army, rose. They rose not as isolated rebels, but as the vanguard of a rage that had been building for decades beneath the surface of company rule. What followed was not a simple military uprising, but something far more complex, a rebellion that drew together threads of resentment from across Indian society. Zamindars who had lost land, craftspeople who had watched their livelihoods destroyed by cheaper British manufactures, princes who had been deposed, Muslim and Hindu populations who felt the weight of foreign governance, farmers who had been taxed to the breaking point. For nearly 2 years, from 1856 into 1858, the rebellion spread across much of northern India, and the company's certainty of its own permanence began to crack. The rebellion was brutal. It was chaotic. Neither the company's forces nor the rebels treated one another with restraint. Massacres occurred. Atrocities were committed by both sides. And in the smoke of these conflicts, something fundamental became clear to the men in Westminster. The company could no longer govern alone. It had grown too ambitious, its apparatus too unwieldy, its actions too difficult to account for in parliamentary proceedings that demanded some semblance of coherence and national oversight. Think, for a moment, about what was happening in the minds of the British political establishment. They watched the rebellion unfold through dispatches that arrived by ship, delayed by weeks or months, each communication more alarming than the last. They saw the company's army stretched thin. They saw British civilians and soldiers dead. They saw, perhaps, the fragility of the entire enterprise. And they began to ask themselves a question that had been forming for some time. Could the company be trusted? Could a private corporation, motivated by profit, adequately govern the millions of people it had come to rule? The rebellion was eventually suppressed. British reinforcements arrived. Company forces, with the assistance of troops sent directly by the Crown, gradually regained control. By 1858, the immediate military crisis had passed, but the psychological crisis, the crisis of legitimacy, could not be so easily dismissed. In the aftermath, there emerged a consensus among the political classes in Britain that the company's experiment in private governance had reached its end. The very powers that had once been granted to a trading company in a charter now seemed too vast, too grave, to remain in private hands. The notion that profit and imperial rule could coexist in the same institution began to seem not innovative, but dangerous, and so the machinery of government began to turn toward dissolution. The Government of India Act of 1858 formalized what had become inevitable. The company's administrative and military powers were transferred to the Crown. The Board of Control, which had long shadowed the Court of Directors, simply absorbed its functions. The company did not disappear overnight. There was no dramatic collapse. Instead, there was a quiet, bureaucratic transition. The ships continued to sail. The ledgers continued to be filled. But the authority, the sovereignty, the right to make law and wage war, these powers passed from the shareholders to the monarch. For those shareholders, there was a peculiar kind of mourning. Some made fortunes from their holdings. Others saw their investments become merely financial instruments, with no political power attached. The company that had once negotiated with emperors, commanded armies, taxed nations, was now simply a trading enterprise among other trading enterprises. The transformation was so complete, so swift in historical terms, that within a generation it became almost difficult to remember that it had ever been anything more. What did the company's dissolution mean for the millions of Indians who had lived under its rule? For those who had participated in the rebellion, it meant that the immediate cause of their revolt, the company's administration, had been addressed. But it meant also that they would now live under direct crown rule, which would prove, in many respects, even more systematized, even more extractive than what had come before. The rebellion had toppled one form of foreign authority only to strengthen another. Consider the peculiar irony embedded in these events. The company had been born from merchants' ambitions, from the desire to profit from trade. Over 2 centuries, those ambitions had morphed into something entirely different, into territorial conquest, into taxation, into the machinery of state. And in the end, the institution was destroyed, not because it had failed to make money, but because it had succeeded too completely in becoming something other than what it was meant to be. It had become an empire, and empires, the British political classes decided, should remain in the hands of the state alone. The last century and a half of company rule had left scars across the landscape. Millions had died, not only in the rebellion, but in famines, in wars, in the disruption of economies that had existed for centuries. The fabric of Indian society had been torn and rewoven according to patterns designed in London. And now, with the dissolution formally complete, that reshaping would continue under a different authority, but the underlying logic would remain much the same. The ships that bore the company's flag continued to sail for some years afterward. Clerks, who had worked for the company, often transitioned seamlessly to Crown service. The structures that the company had built, the ports, the roads, the administrative hierarchies, remained, now repurposed under government authority rather than private corporate mandate. In many ways, the transition was so smooth that the average person living in India might scarcely have noticed the shift in the letterhead, the change in whose seal appeared on official documents. And yet something had shifted in the relationship between power and profit, between corporate ambition and state authority. The experiment in private empire was over. Whether that was for better or worse would occupy historians for centuries to come. For now, in the quiet aftermath of rebellion and institutional collapse, India had simply exchanged one form of foreign rule for another, and the great mechanisms of extraction and control continued to function, now under the colours of the crown rather than the company's flag. And so, on a quiet afternoon in 1874, the East India Company ceased to exist, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the simple administrative dissolution of its charter. The ships that had carried its flag across the Indian Ocean for nearly 3 centuries were repurposed or sold. The buildings remained, their walls still bearing the faint imprints of centuries of ledgers and correspondence. The men and women who had built its networks, negotiated its treaties, and profited from its machinery drifted into other endeavors, or faded from the historical record entirely. But something of the company lingered in the structures it had left behind, in the railways that now crisscrossed the Indian subcontinent, in the administrative apparatus that the British Crown inherited and refined, in the very shape of global trade itself. When we step back from the particular drama of chartered rights and share prices and military victories, something curious becomes visible. There is no clear moment when the East India Company stopped being a merchant enterprise and became something else entirely. There is no single signature, no declared transformation, no fanfare announcing that commerce had given way to conquest. Instead, there is a gradual, almost imperceptible blurring of boundaries. A company chartered to trade becomes fortified. A fortified trading post becomes a garrison. A garrison becomes a seat of local authority. Authority expands, consolidates, reaches outward, and suddenly, without anyone quite deciding to cross it, that line between trader and ruler has been left far behind. This blurring is perhaps the most consequential aspect of the company's long existence, more consequential, even, than any single victory or failed negotiation. For the East India Company did not invent the idea of conquest, nor did it invent the machinery of imperial rule, but it demonstrated, to investors and statesmen and ambitious men across Europe, that private capital could do the work of empire more efficiently, more profitably, and with far less direct accountability than traditional states could manage. The company became a template. It became a proof of concept, and that proof rippled outward into the world that followed, shaping how nations would later think about trade, territory, and the relationship between private interest and public power. Consider, if you will, the strange paradox at the heart of the company's story. It began as a private enterprise, chartered by the Crown, but fundamentally answerable to its shareholders. Those shareholders demanded returns. They demanded profits. They demanded that the merchants and soldiers and administrators who worked in their name deliver wealth back across the oceans to London. And yet, in pursuing those returns, the company ended up governing territories larger than most European kingdoms, collecting taxes, administering justice, raising armies, waging wars, and making decisions that affected the lives of millions of people who had never consented to be governed by it, who had never purchased a share in it, who had no voice in its deliberations. A private company had become, in all but name, a sovereign power, and that sovereign power answered not to those it governed, but to distant shareholders who had never set foot in the lands their wealth extracted from. There is a particular kind of quiet that surrounds this realization. It is not the quiet of sleep, but something deeper, the quiet of understanding something that one wishes, in some small way, could have been otherwise. The company did not cause the decline of India as a center of global manufacturing and wealth. That decline was already underway, driven by deeper shifts in global economics and technology, but the company accelerated it. The company systematized it. The company transformed what might have remained a series of local accommodations into a comprehensive structure of extraction that hollowed out entire regions, disrupted ancient trade networks, and transformed the relationship between land, labor, and capital in ways that persisted long after the company itself had dissolved. And yet, and this is perhaps the most complex meditation of all, the people who made these decisions, who built these structures, who sent ships and soldiers to the other side of the world, were not, in any simple sense, evil. They were ambitious, yes. They were often callous to suffering they did not witness. They were constrained by the ideologies of their time, by the certainties that seemed to justify their actions. They were human beings, shaped by the world they inherited and the incentives they faced. Robert Clive, a man haunted by his own actions, whose conscience eventually fractured under the weight of what he had witnessed and wrought. The clerks and factors in Surat and Calcutta, often young men far from home, adapting to a foreign world while serving a system they did not create. The soldiers, ordinary men bearing arms for wages, caught in the momentum of expansion. The ships themselves, wooden vessels whose construction and sailing required the labor of thousands, whose routes and cargoes were determined by forces larger than any individual will. The legacy of the East India Company is thus not a simple thing. It is not a story of villainy, though there is villainy in it. It is not a story of inevitable progress, though there are elements of technological and organizational innovation woven through its history. Rather, it is a story about how systems work, how individual ambitions, legitimate commercial needs, political pressures, and distant incentives combine to create structures that develop a momentum of their own, that expand beyond the intentions of any single decision-maker, that transform the world in ways that persist long after the original actors have left the stage. The company's trading posts eventually became the skeleton of the British Raj. Its armies became the template for how private capital could project power across vast distances. Its administrative systems, its hierarchies, its methods of record-keeping and control persisted and were refined by the colonial bureaucracy that followed. Its monopolies, broken by law and public pressure, gave way to the more diffuse networks of imperial capitalism that would characterize the 19th and 20th centuries. The particular company disappeared, but the logic that animated it, that profit and power could be aligned, that the accumulation of wealth justified the reshaping of societies, that distance and difference could be managed through hierarchy and force, that logic endured. And beyond the company's immediate heirs, beyond the colonial empires that would inherit its structures and refine its methods, there is something even deeper that the company's history speaks to. It speaks to the persistent tension between private interest and public good, between the mechanisms of commerce and the mechanisms of governance, between the logic of markets and the logic of citizenship. These tensions did not originate with the East India Company. They are older than corporations themselves. But the company brought them into sharp relief, showed what could happen when a private enterprise was given the tools and the distance to exercise power without much accountability. And those tensions, in various forms, persist to this day, in debates about corporate power, about the role of private capital in shaping public policy, about the relationship between profit and responsibility. Perhaps this is why the story of the East India Company continues to call to us, even now, from across 3 centuries, not because it is a simple morality tale, but because it is a complicated mirror held up to something persistent in human ambition and organization. The company was not the first to blur the line between trade and empire. It will not be the last. But for a long moment in history, it embodied that blurring so completely, so systematically, so successfully, that its example shaped the world that followed. The world we still inhabit, still navigate, still try to understand. As the mind begins to drift now, carried along by the currents of history and the weight of all these small, consequential moments, the charters signed in candle-lit rooms, the ships that sailed with the monsoons, the treaties negotiated between rulers and merchants, the soldiers who marched into territory they had been sent to claim, one might wonder what the men and women of the East India Company would think of the legacy they left behind. Would they recognize themselves in the world their ambitions created? Would they have made different choices had they been able to perceive the full arc of consequence? These are questions without answers, and perhaps that is as it should be. History offers us knowledge, but not wisdom. It offers us understanding of how we came to be here, in this moment, this world. And sometimes that understanding is enough. is, in fact, all we can really grasp, as the light of this story gently fades and the deeper stillness begins to settle in around the edges of thought, soft and patient and eternal.